They thought it was routine. A form stamped, a clock obeyed. A prisoner cashing in his last wish before the needle. He asked to see his dog. Not a feast, not a pardon, not a phone call to a ghost. Just the animal that met him in the ruins of his life and taught him to be gentle again. When that dog finally crossed the prison threshold, what unfolded was larger than a goodbye. It was proof that love remembers what the law forgets, that forgiveness sometimes arrives on 4 tired legs, and that a condemned man can still change a room full of living hearts. Morning entered the prison like an apology that had lost its words. The light came thin, washing the concrete the way rain washes the names off old posters, softly but without regret. In Cell 3 East, Elias Ward sat awake before the first buzzer. He had learned that sleep is a gatekeeper and dawn a negotiator, and a man who owes both time and blood must meet the day first, before it meets him. He combed his hair with the blunt plastic comb the state provided and smoothed the front of his shirt until the fabric agreed to behave. It was not vanity. It was a ceremony. If dignity had been taken from him in the loud hours, he would reclaim a thread of it in the quiet ones. On the steel desk, he placed 2 books side by side, a battered Bible and a thin manual on small engine repair, both gifts from men who had run out of better gifts. Beneath them lay a folded paper on which he had written a list the night before. Breathe, stand, listen, look. It was not a plan so much as a way to keep from drowning. Elias once belonged to a neighborhood where people measured wealth by the number of names you knew at the corner store. The city kept small promises back then, trash collected on time or mostly, the bus crouching to let a grandmother on. He had grown up with hands that could fix things. A door that stuck, a fan that rattled, a bicycle chain that insisted on jumping its gear. Work came in seasons and then went. First the good contracts, then the odd jobs, then the phone calls that began with, "I know a guy who knows a guy." When the rent thinned, the compromises thickened. He called them bridges at first. Later he learned the word was trap. He met the dog in the kind of winter that makes metal taste like coin on the tongue. Behind the grocery store, a rusted dumpster leaned like a tired monument. There, in a crease of shadow that smelled of cardboard and thin soup, a dog watched him with the patience of the already abandoned. Brown and white, ribs drawn like the strings of a silent instrument, eyes dark as wet bark. Elias broke a stale heel of bread in 2, then into 4, then into something like prayer. The dog stepped forward, measuring risk the way the poor measure kindness. When it finally took the food, it did not swallow like a thief. It chewed carefully, as if grateful to be trusted with the act. He called the dog Sparrow not because it flew, but because it survived cold by learning the shapes of roofs. Sparrow slept the first night under the radiator of Elias's 1-room apartment, a trembling comma at the end of a long sentence. By morning, the room had acquired a heartbeat that wasn't his. Sparrow learned the sound of the kettle, the scrape of the chair, the sigh a man makes when shame leaves and something like purpose sits down in its place. When Elias fixed things for neighbors, Sparrow would curl at the threshold, guarding nothing and everything, the way love does when it has no job but to remain. The day the sirens came, Sparrow hid under the bed, not out of cowardice, but from a precise understanding of the difference between noise that passes and noise that stays. Elias did not run. The question of guilt did not change the choreography of handcuffs. After the trial, after the language of law arranged his past into a weapon and his future into a corridor, the apartment was emptied with bureaucratic efficiency. Sparrow went with a woman from a shelter who promised to do right by him. The animal did not look back as he left. Animals do not perform longing the way people do, they live it. In the weeks that followed, Elias would carry the weight of that unperformed glance like an extra rib. Years wear the inside of a prison the way a river wears rock, in grooves that deepen, in patience that pretends to be surrender. Elias learned the hours by sound. The metallic yawn of doors, the coughs folded into blankets in winter, the small grief that travels from cell to cell and speaks every language badly. He learned which guards moved like warnings and which moved like men. He wrote letters he did not send. He kept a calendar not to count days, but to keep from miscounting himself. Sparrow's name lived where names live when they have no address, in the soft space between heartbeat and breath, where memory rehearses love so it won't forget the steps. When the chaplain brought him the paper that asked for his final wishes, Elias held the pen as if it were a fragile instrument. He did not write for long. He did not ask for a meal big enough to impersonate a holiday. He wrote a name and a sentence, "I would like to see Sparrow." He did not argue his case. He did not room on a floor that had once only known his own 2 feet. He simply wrote the truth and trusted it to find a path if it was allowed to be a path. Paperwork is a weather system. Somewhere a clerk squinted. Somewhere an administrator thought of liability. Somewhere a sergeant imagined headlines and shook his head. Mercy, to survive in an institution must dress like procedure. The chaplain understood this. He carried the request through offices the way a man carries a candle along a windy hall, cupped, upright, unashamed. When the warden said he'd consider it, the chaplain nodded as if he had been handed a yes. Consideration is a door. Faith is learning to put its hand on the knob. Elias did not count on it. Hope, in his experience, could be a talented thief. He returned to his small orders. The folded blanket, the lined-up books, the careful shave that refused to let his face become a map of neglect. Yet something warmed in him despite himself, the way a floor remembers sun long after the window has grown dark. He found himself listening for footsteps that weren't part of the usual choreography. He found himself rehearsing silence, not to protect himself from disappointment, but to make sure he would have enough of it when the moment came. On the other side of the river, Sparrow's life had continued in human shapes. A shelter, a foster, a child who tucked his hand into the dog's collar at night, as if plugging himself back into the world. Another home, then a return. Some families want love to come trained to their chosen size. Through each change, Sparrow remained what he had always been, a creature whose first language was weather and second language was tone. When the handler came to his kennel that morning, Sparrow rose with the deliberate grace of the old or the wise. The leash looked like ceremony on him, not restraint. The van pulled up to the outer gate as if afraid to arrive. Steel receives visitors without enthusiasm. Paper was passed. Signatures rehearsed their importance. The handler kept her voice low, aware that loudness in such places is half insult, half armor. Sparrow watched everything, refusing to give his attention to anything that didn't deserve it. When the inner door opened, he did not surge forward. He stepped the way a pilgrim steps after months of maps, carefully, with the future unfolding underfoot. Inside, men who usually studied only the floor studied the hallway. A rumor had skittered ahead of the dog like sunlight along water. Even those who scoffed at sentiment felt the air adjusting. The younger guard let his coffee cool. The older one set his jaw in the position that meant nothing had happened to him in a long time and nothing would begin now. Somewhere in a control room, a camera blinked to prove to the system that it was there. Proof is a language of machines. Presence is another. They put Elias in a visitation room they had emptied of metal chairs. The walls wore the attentive indifference of paint applied over paint, history flattened into compliance. A clock clicked like an insect. The chaplain stood with his hands quiet at his sides, as if afraid to scare away a bird. Elias breathed the way a diver drinks air after the surface. He did not expect the door to open. He made his breath a home for the moment so that if it came it would know where to sit. The knob turned. The handler entered. And then the past did, on 4 legs that carried the patient nobility of 1,000 small forgive-me's and it's okays traded across winters. Sparrow's muzzle was salted with gray. His eyes were undiminished. The room forgot to be a room. It became a clearing. Elias did not speak. He stretched his hands forward, palms open, and lowered himself until his knees understood the floor. Sparrow crossed the space as if following a path only he could see, a path that had once wound around a radiator and a stove and a worn second-hand table with one leg shorter than the others. The first touch was not theatrical. It was a nose against skin, a forehead settled beneath a human chin, a breath shared without permission because permission was irrelevant. Love, when it has waited long enough, does not knock. Something inside the prison changed its weight. Not policy. Not steel. The uncounted thing. The younger guard looked away to protect his face from giving him away. The older one kept his jaw hard. But his stance admitted gravity had shifted. The chaplain's eyes closed because some prayers are answered by absence of noise. The camera, blank-eyed, recorded movement and missed the miracle. Elias pressed his palm along Sparrow's ribs and found in their rise and fall a metronome the state could not command. He felt something loosen in him that was not an argument, not a defense, only the truth standing up after years of sitting down. He thought of the door he had repaired in Miss Herrera's kitchen, how it had insisted on sticking until he sanded the edge no one saw. He had been sanding his life ever since on the edges, where the visible but undeniable. Sparrow licked once at his wrist, not to forgive, not to request, just to continue what had been interrupted. A throat cleared near the door, an apology disguised as authority. Time is a tyrant that hates to be upstaged. The handler glanced at the clock, then back at the men on the floor, as if deciding which god to obey. The chaplain inclined his head toward the guard, a signal that the necessary would be allowed to stand near the holy. Elias lifted his face, not to beg for more minutes but to memorize. Memory, like hunger, has to be fed or else it eats the wrong things. What he fed it was detail. The way Sparrow's fur had coarsened along the spine, the clean animal smell like warm straw and rain, the rasp of tongue against the heel of his hand, the almost imperceptible tremor that lived in the dog's legs and resolved when Elias breathed deeper. He remembered the chipped bowl, the radio that had only 2 stations, the night the power had gone out and he had told a story about a boy who learned to fix the dark. The boy had been himself. He had not been good at it then. He believed, for an unmeasured moment on that floor, that he had learned later. The room took back its edges by degrees. Time pressed a hand against the meeting. The handler moved one step closer, routine returning to claim what routine always claims. Elias nodded before anyone asked. A man who had lived long enough with loss to understand that keeping everything breaks more than it saves. He bent his head until his forehead touched Sparrow's again. He did not whisper goodbye. Goodbye is a word with too much theater for certain kinds of love. He whispered silently, "Thank you." Outside, rain began that the forecast had insisted would hold off. Inside, boots shuffled. Doors considered their purpose. The moment had not ended. It had only changed shape. A roomful of living hearts adjusted their weight to fit around what they had just seen and felt and would not name. They gave them more minutes than the paper allowed, not because rules had bent, but because the people holding the rules had leaned. Mercy often arrives as posture before it becomes policy. The handler checked the door for watchers who might object and found only a hallway pretending not to listen. Sparrow settled with the kind of sigh dogs keep for safety, a sound like gravel remembering it was once river. Elias used the minutes as a craftsman uses wood. No waste, no rush, no unconsidered cuts. He did not relive the crime. He had done that in courts and in the long theater of the night. He relived the small salvations. A neighbor's laugh through thin walls. Sparrow's insistence on a walk when the day had been particularly cruel. The first time a child on the 3rd floor asked him to fix a bike and he said yes without charging. And the child looked at him as if a stranger had returned something the world had stolen. He let himself inhabit those rooms again, not to prove anything, but to gather what would be needed when the corridor narrowed. The chaplain, whose vocation was the management of thresholds, stood quiet as weather. He watched the dog's chest rise and fall in time with Elias's, 2 creatures synchronized by something beyond training. He thought of the theology textbooks on his shelf and how none had a chapter called On Dogs, who outperform sermons. He understood that salvation is a word too big for any one story and too small for moments like this. The human heart names with clumsy hands. Heaven, if it keeps records, writes differently. In the control room, a supervisor rewound the feed to make sure everything that should be there was there. He saw only a man and a dog in a room and wondered why his throat felt tight. He turned the volume down on a speaker that wasn't on. In an office 2 floors up, the warden took a call and said the same 3 phrases he had always said on mornings like this. When he hung up, he looked at a framed photo on his desk of his daughter at 6 with a mutt she had named Princess for reasons she never explained. He rubbed his jaw until the heat there faded. Nothing had changed and everything had. Elias lifted Sparrow's paw and placed it gently against his chest, a gesture he had taught the dog long ago, not as a trick but as a shared acknowledgement. Here, inside this thudding cage, is where we keep what we cannot afford to lose. Sparrow tolerated the ritual with the patient dignity of the very loved. When the paw slid down, it dragged across cloth, catching on a loose thread, a tiny snag that felt like a signature. He wondered, not for the first time, if goodness could be made of habits rather than epiphanies. The world honored lightning and headlines. Sparrow honored routine, the bowl rinsed, the walk taken even in rain, the space left on the couch for a small warm body to claim. Elias had failed at lightning. Perhaps, had he been given another life, he would have mastered habit. The thought did not come bitter. Came like weather across a field, noticed, accepted, naming nothing it could change. Time gestured again. The handler stepped forward. apology forming like a blemish on her face. Elias spared her the pain of speaking. He nodded and pushed himself up from the floor, joints telling the truth about years that had not been spent kindly. Sparrow rose with him, stretching one rear leg at a time, the old dog's bow that looks like respect. Elias stood fully and looked down, then out, then up, down at the animal that had taught him gentleness, out at the room that had contained a small miracle without breaking, up toward the idea that someone somewhere might be keeping score of the right things for once. He reached for the leash, not to take it, but to bless it with his touch. The handler held the loop a little too tightly, as if afraid of dropping duty on the floor and watching it roll under a chair. Sparrow, reading tone rather than grip, leaned his weight into Elias one last time. Elias breathed it in. The smell of dog is the smell of life, unashamed of itself. Earth and sun and old rugs and something clean beneath all of it that refuses to translate. The guards opened the door wider than necessary. That is the language too. Sparrow stepped through, then stopped and turned, a precise pivot performed without instruction. Animals are not sentimental, but they are thorough. He looked at Elias the way he had looked the night the power went out years ago, steady, unconcerned with human categories, asking and answering the same question at once. Are you here? I am here. The handler made a small sound between throat and breath, a seam ripping invisibly. The corridor tasted like metal. The floor welcomed footsteps with a tired shine. As the handler led Sparrow away, the dog's nails ticked a metronome that the hallway hadn't heard since it was poured. The sound traveled farther than the dog did. It found cells where men had learned to avoid remembering. It found ears that had only known orders. It found a clock and asked it to be kind. Elias remained in the room after the door closed, as if the space needed him to sit with it until the air learned how to be ordinary again. The chaplain approached and did not speak. Silence is a craft, and he practiced it well. Elias finally nodded, and the nod contained more sentences than most men say in a month. They walked back to the cell together, a slow procession of two, leaving behind a floor that would, for a while, keep a warm patch where a good dog had lain. In his cell, Elias sat and allowed the world to arrange itself around him. He did not collapse. He did not rehearse grief. He moved the comb an inch, centered the books, lifted the folded paper and wrote one more word beneath the list. Receive. He wasn't sure what would arrive, only that he would stand still enough to take it without dropping it at his feet. What arrived first was memory, not of crime but of repair. The day he fixed Ms. Herrera's door, she had said, "It sticks on humid mornings. I think the house remembers too much rain." He had sanded the invisible edge until the door remembered how to be a door again. She had paid him in cash and tamales, and the kind of gratitude that refuses to degrade into worship. Sparrow had slept in the kitchen that afternoon, belly up on cool tile, as if convinced that heaven was a small room with cumin in the air. It had been a good day, not because it had saved anything, but because it had left nothing broken. He held that day until it ran out of color, then let it go. He took another. A boy with a front tire chewed by time, his bike unrideable, his face set in the hard line kids learn too early. Elias had patched the tube and trued the wheel and sent the child flying down the block as if the street had been invented for him. Sparrow had chased, not to catch but to accompany. The boy had returned breathless and pressed a melting popsicle into Elias's hand, red and ridiculous, sticky gratitude in a heat that punished the careless. It had been another good day for the same reason. The chaplain returned after a while with water. He did not offer as consolation but as necessity. Elias drank and felt the ordinary gift settle in him. He wanted, suddenly, and with a fierceness he had not allowed, to outlive this hour long enough to do one more small repair for a stranger. He wanted to sand something invisible back to fit. The wanting did not wound him. It steadied him, the way desire sometimes steadies a man when he finally aims it at what will not betray him. Outside, weather changed its mind again. The rain stopped mid-sentence and left the sky tasting of tin. Inside, the institution recovered its posture. Keys spoke their impatient language. Radios resumed their catechism of codes. Men whose faces had softened tightened them back up, the way uniforms require. Yet the softening had happened, and that is not nothing. In places like this, not nothing is a currency one learns to spend carefully. Word of the dog's visit traveled the tiers with the dark speed of rumor. Some men scoffed because scoffing is armor. Some held the story like contraband and took sips when no one was looking. In a cell 2 doors down, a man who had not spoken in 3 weeks whispered to the wall. "Luck." In the laundry, a trustee folded towels with an attention he had not previously found. Attention is a cousin to love. Both change the weight of common objects. Elias lay back on the narrow bed and closed his eyes without trying to sleep. Behind his lids the room remained, faithfully, with its clock and its camera and the square of air that had been wholly long enough to matter. He did not bargain with heaven. He did not even knock on the door. He set his gratitude on the threshold and left it there unwrapped. If someone opened from the other side and carried it in, good. If not, the gift would remain and that would be enough. Minutes entered their measured march. Somewhere, a printer ratcheted out paper that would be carried by solemn hands at an hour none of them would claim as their own. Somewhere else, a phone rehearsed the ring it would later perform. In a small office, the chaplain wrote a note in his tidy script. Mercy witnessed. Hearts altered. He didn't know where to file such a thing. He left it on his desk under a paperweight shaped like a lighthouse, as if to suggest that light, when properly placed, outlasts storm. Near the end of the day, an officer brought Elias a single envelope. No return address. The ink hesitant, as if unused to the honesty required by a line. Inside was a photograph printed at a drugstore, glossy, already acquiring fingerprints. Sparrow under a child's arm on a porch, both of them squinting at a sun that meant exactly well. On the back, in a child's hand, 4 words. He sleeps with me. No name. No plea. Just the sentence which contained a dozen others. He is safe. He is loved. He is someone's. Your love continued without you and landed well. Elias placed the photograph between the 2 books. He did not cry. Tears would have been too easy a language, too familiar to a room whose corners knew the shape of men surrendering to salt. He chose instead to smile, a small smile that did not reach his mouth so much as rearrange his bones. The smile said, "A good thing happened where I was not, and that is a better miracle than the kind that needs me present to perform." Night stepped to the bars and asked its ancient question. Elias answered by turning on the little bulb above the desk and reading 2 paragraphs from the manual about carburetors, the humility of air and fuel agreeing to meet at the right time. Then he closed the book and allowed his thoughts to become a prayer without words, a wide field with no fence where a dog could run until even memory was tired and lay down. When the light clicked off, the room did not darken all the way. Something stayed lit, faint but insistent, the way a pilot flame hides until called upon. Elias folded his hands on his chest the way a man does when he is not ready to die, and also not willing to pretend he can live forever. He thought once more of Sparrow's paw on his shirt, the snag of the thread like a signature, and signed the moment back with his breath. In, out, proof of life in a place designed to manage death. By morning, the world would come to collect him and the story would lean toward the machinery waiting at the end of the hall. But the day he had just lived belonged to 2 creatures who had once shared an apartment, a winter, and the discipline of small kindnesses. The law could continue its work. Love had already completed part of its own. Morning returned with a careful face, as if afraid to wake what yesterday had changed. The prison stood in its posture, but something in the shoulders had lowered. Men who kept their eyes trained on the floor, now lifted them a fraction, like plants experiment with light in bad soil. The rumor of the dog had hardened into a story. Stories are sturdier than rules because they know how to travel without permission. Elias woke from a night that never fully arrived. Sleep had hovered at the doorway uncertain, then taken a seat where Sparrow had lain earlier, close enough to comfort, too reverent to touch. He sat up, combed, straightened, and placed his hand over the photograph of Sparrow under the child's arm. It was a small act of stewardship. He understood at last that love did not need proximity to remain true. Sometimes it needed to be given away to stay alive. The chaplain stopped at his door, not to check, not to preach, simply to stand in the weather Elias carried with him. Some men bring storms into a room. Elias today brought the kind of clear cold that makes a person honest without cruelty. The chaplain moved on, collecting the temperature as if it were a note he would need later. On the other tiers, the story kept working. A man on laundry duty folded more precisely than the job required. He had seen things yesterday he could not name, and precision was his way of kneeling. In the kitchen, a trustee slid an extra ladle of oats into bowls and then, mid-motion, leveled them back to even. He remembered the dog's head against the prisoner's chest and chose fairness over charity. Even the keys sounded different on belts, as if metal had listened and agreed to soften its clatter. Beyond the handler wrote her report in the dry language of incident forms: date, time, duration, behavior observed. Every sentence behaved itself until the last line, when her hand betrayed her and added a clause about observable de-escalation among present staff. She underlined nothing, but the phrase curled like smoke toward a mind that had been waiting for a reason to act. In a city office with late light on a green file cabinet, an aide from the governor's team saw the form attached to an email labeled routine and did not believe the label. He flagged it not as mercy but as data. Data is the only form of faith some offices are allowed to practice. Elias spent the early hours in the library, which wasn't a room so much as a claim that books could survive anywhere. The overhead fan had been stuttering so long that men had adjusted their sentences to fit between its coughs. He stood on a plastic chair and loosened the housing with a patience that had never impressed the world outside but had saved 1,000 humbler days. He cleaned the dust in careful rings, set the screws with the light confident touch that says, "I know the difference between tight and true," then pulled the chain. The blades turned, steady as a bedtime story. A man pretending to read looked up as if wind had learned to whisper again. He left a note taped to the wall, cleaned, balanced, oiled. "Will last if respected." He did not sign his name. Some repairs wanted anonymity the way some prayers want no witnesses. In the afternoon he asked for paper. Not the kind that holds a petition or a defense, but the private sort that receives a human heart without trying to cross-examine it. He wrote to the anonymous child who had sent the photograph. He couldn't send the letter. Protocol kept the child's identity as guarded as any cell, but writing was a form of sending, and the chaplain had taught him the math of that. If the heart expresses, the world is altered somewhere, even if you never learn the address. He wrote about Sparrow's heavy sleep and about a winter when they ran out of heat and the dog taught him that warmth could be made in layers: blanket, body, breath, the patient architecture of staying. He told the child that Sparrow had always preferred the sound of a kettle to the sound of the radio, and that if, on some nights, fear woke boys in houses where the locks worked, a dog's collar could be a handle on the dark. He folded the page and placed it in the Bible, where the thin paper would keep it safe without promising to deliver it. A guard lingered outside the door. The young one. The man whose coffee had gone cold the day before. He shifted his weight and stared at the cinder block the way men stare at water when they would rather not look at their own reflection. He had gone home the previous night and stood on a porch that leaned, listening to his own dog scuff the floor behind the door, and he had felt the day shed its armor one buckle at a time. He didn't say anything now. He let his presence be the sentence for which he had not found words. Elias nodded once, not as acknowledgement but as hospitality, permission granted for a feeling to share the same hallway. Letters arrived with their practiced brutality. Some were circulars with equations pretending to be justice. Some were catalogs of versions of shirts he would never wear again. One was a folded page with a careful script. It was not from the victim's family. The law had made such crossings nearly impossible at this hour. It was from a woman 2 floors up in administration who had processed his file more times than she wished to count. She wrote 3 lines, professional, unadorned, all of them carrying more than ink. "Your request was granted because it was human. Thank you for reminding us to remain so." Yes. He placed that note with the photograph. He was building a small altar the state could not see. Dog, child, administrator. Proofs of a world with corridors wider than these. In the yard, air moved with a rare permission. A man with a bluish tattoo that time had blurred watched the sky and, for the first time in a winter of losses, remembered the smell of the river he had grown up beside. He did not tell anyone. He simply stood straighter, as if a rope had been cut inside him that had been pulling him down. Nearby, another man who had spent several months rehearsing rage like a skill placed his hands behind his back and measured his breath until the anger blinked and forgot what it was doing there. Late in the day, the chaplain brought news in the careful tone of a man who knows how to carry glass through crowds. The board would convene for a procedural review. Not mercy, not reprieve, a meeting half-owed by the calendar. He said nothing beyond those facts. He didn't need to. The possibility at the edge of the room grew a little taller. It still did not call itself hope. Called itself attention. On a desk far away, the handler's report acquired companions. An email from a corrections officer, anonymous by policy, brave by choice, Was forwarded to the same aide. Observed reduced tension on tier following canine visit. Prisoner demonstrated calm influence. Recommend exploration of structured animal therapy. It was the kind of cold sentence that could be carried past defenses. Programs like budgets coat themselves in neutrality and glide where tears would be intercepted and returned. Elias spent the evening repairing a different object. A man. He spoke no words, but he sat on the floor outside a cell where panic had moved in the previous week and refused to pay rent. He matched his breathing to the jagged rhythm inside and waited. The breathing evened. The panic, which had been bold in a crowd, lost its courage in the narrow focus of two lungs. When the man inside finally slept, Elias stood slowly, joints clicking protest, and moved on, leaving behind the only kind of medicine he trusted himself to administer: presence without demand. Night gathered at the bars. It did not argue. Took its place ancient as arithmetic. Elias lay back. The photograph and the administrator's note and the unsent letter arranged like stars in a pattern that someone else might someday give a name. He let the day's small repairs settle into their joints. Came for him tomorrow, it would find him returned to himself. Not cleansed of guilt, not painted with innocence, but sanded at the edges until the door could move again. Somewhere, a phone began to practice the ring it would use in earnest. Somewhere else a printer warmed, its rollers softened by heat. Paper would move, words would be carried, decisions would be dressed in the uniforms they preferred. Inside the cell, a man breathed with the steady certainty of someone who had learned that survival is sometimes nothing more than refusing to look away from the good that still shows up. The review was scheduled the way storms are, announced by maps that never quite matched the sky. The board would assemble late, after the day's other business had been checked off with tired pens. The warden prepared his remarks. He was a fair man according to his own calculus, which consistently erred toward the arithmetic of systems. He would report compliance and procedure, and the absence of incident. What he would not report was the temperature of the rooms, the new way men were holding silence, the noise the dog's paws had made in a corridor that had forgotten it could be music. In the chapel, which doubled as a storage space for abandoned belief, the chaplain gathered pages he would not be asked to present. Notes from custodial staff about fewer curses thrown between cells, a log showing reduced requests for medical sedatives on the tier, a line he underlined twice from his own journal: mercy changes math. He placed the packet in a folder regardless. Preparedness is a form of prayer. Elias requested nothing extra and was given nothing extra. He ate what was offered, drank what was allowed, and maintained the small liturgy of order he had adopted as defense against days that came at him with teeth. He polished the desk with the heel of his hand until the steel looked vaguely like a mirror and returned an honest man to himself, wrinkled, older than the age printed on the file, but arranged around a spine that had finally chosen a shape. He regarded that reflection without vanity. He simply wanted, before leaving, to tell his face the truth. Mid-morning, the young guard paused again. He had gone home with a steadiness he hadn't known he needed and had found his own dog asleep under the crib, a watchdog with no audience. He stood now at the familiar cinder block and did not force words through a throat not designed to do the heavy lifting for the heart. Instead, he slid through the slot a folded scrap he had written at his locker. "Thank you. You made this place different." It was signed with a letter, not a name. Elias read it, exhaled a blessing his tradition didn't have a word for, and tucked it with his small constellation of grace. The handler returned in the afternoon with nothing to deliver except a nod through glass as she walked past the corridor. She had petitioned for another visit and been told no with words like precedent and security footprint and not advisable. She did not burn at the refusal. She banked it. She imagined a different building on a different day where a program existed because a man and a dog had once broken a room's habit of being only itself. She kept walking. The leash in her hand felt lighter than it used to be, as if the material had been informed of a coming purpose. Outside, the aide mapped an argument that wouldn't embarrass his boss. He collected what systems respected, metrics, not miracles. He compiled recidivism data for facilities that piloted animal therapy, a white paper on empathy training in carceral environments, an internal memo on staff incidents decreasing after controlled canine exposure. He placed the handler's line, observable de-escalation, at the top. He left Elias's name off the cover page, not out of indifference but strategy. He needed a door to open. Names at certain thresholds make doors forget they have hinges. In the late afternoon, the chaplain visited Elias and asked for nothing. He simply laid on the desk a new sheet of lined paper and an envelope stamped with the generic address of the board. Elias understood. He did not compose a plea. He composed an accounting. He wrote of the boy with the popsicle and the fan that had learned to speak in a steady voice and the way a dog's paw had found his shirt and signed the hour. He wrote that he did not deserve mercy by any calculus he would dare propose. And then he wrote that if mercy existed for the undeserving only, it might be allowed to stop in this cell on its way to more important places. He folded the letter, sealed it with the clean press of a flat palm, and handed it back as if returning a borrowed tool. Evening drew its long line. In a conference room with a table that had outlived 3 administrations, the board gathered. They opened folders designed to make human lives presentable, glanced at the clock that made human lives punctual, and considered items that had learned to sit still under fluorescent light. The warden spoke evenly. A member asked whether the canine visit had posed a risk. He answered with a sentence about protocols and handler certifications and remained silent on the scent of that room, which had smelled briefly of rain-washed fields. Silence maintains employment. Truth saves souls. Men pick. A report arrived mid-agenda, routed from an office that had never sent anything on this topic before. The AIDS packet. Bullet points were read out with a formality that hid their eagerness. Reduction in tier tensions. Documented impact in similar institutions. No adverse events. Potential for programmatic exploration. The board shifted in its chairs. Programs make good headlines. They also make lawyers ask fewer questions. The motion was not for clemency. It was for time. 48 hours to review feasibility, and to see whether the governor would prefer to be in front of a wave instead of dragged under it. In the control room, a red light flashed in the quiet, and a phone rang in the warden's office with the specific humility of calls that bring neither death nor deliverance but the most annoying child of both, delay. The warden listened, his jaw learning new angles, and hung up. He did not smile. He did not frown. He adjusted a frame so it sat straight. Order is a habit, even change cannot break at first. The chaplain walked faster than his office required. He understood that words arrive differently depending on the corridor they travel. He entered the cell and stood a full second in the doorway to let the holiness catch up. Then he spoke the only sentence required. There would be more hours than there had been. The clock, which had never asked permission from anyone, agreed to slow by a quantity too small to measure and yet big enough to matter. Elias did not sag. Relief is a weight like any other. It too can bend a man. He remained upright and let the news thread itself through him so it wouldn't snag on hope and tear. He placed his palm over the photograph again and imagined the child asleep under a season that had finally chosen to be kind that night. He imagined Sparrow making the small, satisfied noise he made when dreams sent him running in place on old rugs. He did not ask the future for favors. He thanked the present for the hours. The yard felt different at dusk, like a room after a wake when the last guest leaves and the house remembers it is allowed to live. The men walked in loops that nearly touched, careful not to make a circle because circles invite conversation, and they had not learned yet how to hold this new thing together without breaking it. Above them, clouds tried on colors and kept them all. In administration the woman of the 3-line note, closed her drawer more gently than usual. She had taken, against policy and for the sake of a private ledger, a photocopy of the anonymous letter the child had sent. She did not know why she was keeping it, only that she had spent her career filing everything and needed one thing to remain in her custody unsorted. She placed it underneath a plant that struggled and whispered, without fully forming the thought, that light had learned a new route in this building and would find its way even to leaves. Night advanced. The officer with the letter on his locker sat alone in the break room and let his hands be useless for a while. He thought of the dog hair he had started to notice on his uniform when he left for the night shift, hair that had always been there and had only recently acquired meaning. He decided, for no reason he could explain, to stop yelling when the microwave door slammed. He would close it with his hand from now on and call that an improvement. Elias wrote a second letter with the gift of hours. This one was for the mother of the man his crime had taken. It would never be sent. The channels allowed no such crossing. But words once born travel. He wrote that he would not practice the violence of explanation on her. He wrote that he had spent 7 years building a small altar of repair inside himself in the shape of her son's name. He wrote that if goodness could arrive anywhere near the place where her pain had built its house, he wanted to contribute a chair, a shelf, a nail, something humble and useful that said, "I cannot lift the weight, but I can refuse to add to it." He folded the letter and placed it beneath the manual on small engines. Air and fuel at the right time, the book had taught him, and a spark that does not claim credit for fire. He touched the cover and let the metaphor sit in the room and do what metaphors do, collect meanings the writer never predicted. Past midnight, rain returned, soft as a hand coming back to hold the same place it had held earlier. The prison received it without comment. The river beyond the wire inhaled and exhaled and did not worry about paper. Somewhere, a sleeping child adjusted his grip on a dog's collar and traveled safely to morning. Somewhere else, a woman in administration left the hallway light on, just in case Hope decided it wanted company and didn't want to knock in the dark. At dawn, the world would wait at doors again and ask its questions. For now, an old building full of mistakes and routines rested its weight more tenderly on its own foundations. A man lay on a narrow bed and did not bargain, did not dramatize, did not pretend. He pressed his hand over an image of a dog who had once made winter tolerable, and now made time itself behave for a while. The hours gathered. The story, having found its legs, walked on. Morning arrived like an admission on official paper, partial and signed but carrying the weight of a coming signature. The 48 hours had stretched themselves across the building, thin but firm, a film of possibility covering surfaces that had long gone dull. Men woke into it as into a different climate. Even fatigue tried to be generous. Elias rose into the changed air with the economy of a man who had learned that flourishes exhaust the soul and serve no one. He washed, folded, straightened, and touched the edges of the little shrine he had been building from scraps of mercy. Sparrow's photograph, the anonymous child's scrawl, the administrator's 3 steady lines, the guard's thanks. He did not rearrange them today. He left them as proof that goodness can hold its own shape without constant supervision. In the corridor, the keys announced themselves less loudly. A cart rattled with a sound newly demoted from tyranny to background. The young guard, who had been practicing the craft of silence in front of Elias's door, allowed himself the experiment of a different posture, shoulders that admitted the existence of sky. He had not done anything as dramatic as belief, he had simply stopped resisting the evidence of yesterday's room. That is often the shape of first faith. Beyond the wire, the dog that had started the building thinking differently slept the expensive sleep of safety. Sparrow's new home was not lavish by any of the world's accounts. Porch peeling, fence complaining, toys chewed into the honest shapes dogs believed toys should become, but it was rich in the currency that had saved him once already, attention without audit. The child had taken to tucking his hand inside the collar not from fear but from the fierce ownership love sometimes insists upon when it is young. In the kitchen, a mother stepped carefully around the sleeping pair and did not disturb them. She had lived long enough to know that certain arrangements are negotiations with angels and ought not to be interrupted. The handler, who had written the dry report and accidentally lit a fuse with one clumsy clause, returned to work with a mind newly tuned. She had begun to see leashes as verbs rather than nouns, bridges more than boundaries. On her lunch break she sat in her car and searched for the sort of evidence offices respect, numbers that demonstrate what hearts already know. The screen gave her charts and bullet points and footnotes. Behind each statistic she saw a room like yesterday's, something softening in the face of something faithful. She compiled links and sent them, not to the chaplain or the warden, but to the aide whose subject line had betrayed curiosity the day before. In administration, read the morning schedule and the afternoon's possibilities. Her job had trained her to manage the distance between policy and pulse. The dog had shortened that distance until she could step over it without running. She opened an old drawer that had become the building's attic and pulled out a box with Elias's intake number taped to the side. The box had done what boxes do, carried the story dumbly without comment. She lifted the file with a hand steady from long practice and found beneath the legal architecture a single, mislaid envelope, scuffed, stamped years ago, returned to sender when a forwarding address failed to forward. No name on the outside. Inside, one page. A woman's handwriting that had learned to be brave line by line. I saw him that night in the blue jacket fixing the fan at Herrera's store when the shouting started down the block. If anyone needs to know where he was, tell them I will speak. I can't write my address. I am leaving. Ask at the church near the river. R. No date beyond the postmark. No signature beyond a letter. S. Set the page down as if it might bolt. Paper does not usually carry breath. And yet the room inhaled. She took a photograph with her phone, then another, then wrote on a sticky note the single instruction that sometimes changes everything: follow. The chaplain marked the hours with follow. The chaplain marked the hours with the discipline of a man who had decided to become a metronome in a world addicted to noise. He visited 3 cells where grief had grown webby and old, then went to the laundry and shook a trustee's hand for no reason he could name except that gratitude had to be given exercise or it atrophies. He returned to his office and found S in his doorway holding the envelope like a candle that would refuse to relight if it went out. He read the page, put a finger on the postmark, and saw, as S had seen, the narrow road that might lead out of this thicket. They divided the errand. S would go to the church near the river with a copy tucked into the folder of a woman who looked like she belonged in offices and therefore could walk through the world without having to explain herself at every door. The chaplain would go to the Herrera store and ask about a blue jacket, a fan, a knight. Neither spoke of miracles. They spoke of errands. Miracles are errands on which all the doors happen to open. Elias kept to his liturgy. He repaired a chair in the library that had learned to wobble from too many men leaning on one side of their lives. He rubbed lemon oil into its joints until its loyalty returned. He watched a man in the corner hold a paperback with reverence, not because of the author's fame but because language had remembered how to let him in. He returned to his cell when called and placed his palm on the photograph as if to check a pulse he already knew was there. By afternoon, S had found the church. It kept the river's smell, a mineral patience that churches in other neighborhoods had forgotten. The priest she asked remembered a woman named Rosa who came for the food pantry and left when the man she feared finally took the shape of a move she could make. He remembered a bus ticket pressed into her hand by parishioners who had no money and yet found some. He did not remember a last name. People in flight sometimes loan their surnames to safety and pick them up later far from danger. But he remembered a sister in a different city and a phone call that had ended in relief. He made another call. The number still existed. It rang into a kitchen where a radio played low and a childhood learned how to be safe. A voice answered that would talk if talked to gently. The chaplain's errand was less direct but no less alive. Ms. Herrera's store had changed ownership twice but kept the nail hole where the clock had hung and the ghost of a stain around the fan. The current owner, a man whose relationship to memory was transactional at best, remembered almost nothing that mattered and almost everything that did not. The chaplain did not leave with a name. He left with the assurance that a man in a blue jacket had indeed waited for a part to arrive that week and had been paid in cash and thanks that tasted, as these things do, like rice and lime. Certain details anchor time. When you find them, the day stops slipping. At the governor's office, the aide built the scaffolding around the thing his gut had known within seconds of reading a dog report. He combined S's scanned page, the priest's notes from the call, and the handler's comparative data into a memo that performed the trick good memos perform. It made doing the brave thing look administratively competent. He avoided words like innocence and wrongful. He leaned on process irregularity and new testimonial lead and public safety outcomes. He never once used the word soul. He did not have to. The dog had taught that to anyone who could learn. Back in the cell, the hours did their work on Elias with the unshowy competence of craftsmen. He felt the old dissonances resolved by half-steps. He did not imagine exoneration. He imagined usefulness, which is redemption's favorite suit. He listed in his head the things he would do if tomorrow went the same way as yesterday and the papers refused to learn any new verbs. Steady the panicked, oil the hinge, speak softly into the riot inside a neighbor. He learned in this counting that the future, even the very short one, could be made of service and therefore survive tragedy without rotting. Men on the tier approached him in the currency of prison, glances that lingered half a second longer than safety recommends, shoulders that drifted closer, cups that clinked once against bars in what passes for applause in a place where clapping would be punished as conspiracy. He accepted these tributes with the same manner he had accepted yesterday's miracle, by making room for them and refusing to own them. Glory breaks men too quickly. Honor, if handled carefully, can strengthen the spine without snapping it. The warden felt a current beginning to pull at the foundations of his watertight boat. He checked the hull as executives do. Policy, procedure, precedent, and found all in place. He checked against his training the way the building sounded when he walked it. A quiet had replaced the lower register of perpetual grievance. He did not trust quiet. Quiet can be the instrument of revolt as easily as peace. He walked farther than he intended and, after 3 circuits of the tears, admitted that whatever had been altered was not tactical. It was temperament. The building wanted to be better than it had been. He did not know how to authorize that, and so he did not. He went back to his office and rehearsed neutrality. Night prepared its entrance. The river ferried the city's heat away. The child who slept with his hand in Sparrow's collar told the dog a story in the way children do when they believe language is stronger than sleep. Sparrow listened with his whole body and agreed to every premise. Across town, S called the chaplain with 2 new names and an address the parish had kept safe behind casseroles and small envelopes of cash. She would go in the morning, but first she printed the memo the aide had escalated and slid it beneath the warden's door without a note. Anonymous again, but this time by choice. When the lights dimmed to their practiced level, Elias lay with his hands on his chest and measured his own honesty. He had asked once for a dog. He now asked for nothing beyond the right to keep practicing the habits that made rooms easier to live in for other people. He did not avert his mind from the man whose name he spoke at the end of every day, the victim whose existence he carried with him as a boundary he refused to trespass again. Grief and responsibility shared the bunk. He slept between them like a child who has learned 2 parents can love in the same room without dissolving into war. The phone calls that would align the morning were already leaving messages and waking assistance. The phrase procedural stay extension appeared on a screen that preferred calendar hold. The phrase potential witness development appeared on another that preferred no change. Words fought their small wars while the large one, the one between what had happened and what might still be repaired, continued in the old theater of human hearts, where dogs win cases good lawyers never take. Dawn set a thin coin on the horizon and waited to see who would pick it up. The city did. The river did. The prison, stubborn as an old joke, followed because it had learned yesterday that refusal to learn is not the same as strength. S left early, the letter safely copied, her own name stowed. The neighborhood she drove into had forgotten about maps that color themselves. It remembered only corners where kids made the same bargains their parents had made, and occasionally improved on them. A stoop with 3 chairs held 2 women and a radio. S asked for Rosa by asking for the woman who once waited for the bus to the station with a suitcase the parish had purchased. The nearest woman nodded toward a door with paint learning to let go. Inside, the kitchen remembered every meal it had ever turned into an event. A sister poured coffee into a cup whose chip had unlearned its shame. Rosa arrived from the back room thinner than the letter, stronger than the sentence. She read the photocopy and placed a hand on the counter the way a person does when the past suddenly sits down in the chair across from them. Fear announced itself in the old way and then, seeing who it had been sent to trouble, retreated a few paces out of respect. Rosa nodded once, a signature that lives in the body when signatures on paper have been misused too many times. She would speak. She would say what she saw. She would risk the reckoning. She did not ask whether it would help. Help was not the point. The point was truth appearing in the place where it had been asked to disappear. S called the chaplain from the stoop. He was already en route to meet the priest's contact who remembered details about the store and the fan and the blue jacket that had been recited like a rosary. The priest's contact was an older man with hands that had forgiven 1,000 receipts and remembered the sound of a certain kind of cough Elias had had that winter. A cough of dust and work, not the medicine hunger the street teaches. The man placed Elias in the store at the hour the sirens ran elsewhere. Time acquired a spine. The aide folded these threads into a second memo that did not pretend to be anything but a request for the governor to touch a specific file. He layered witness identification, employer recollection, and the envelope's original postmark. He attached a recommendation from the State Public Defender's Appellate Unit he had quietly alerted the night before, the kind of recommendation that carries both caution and momentum in its measured language. He asked for a hold, not a headline. He avoided the cameras the way men avoid mirrors when they do not want to admire themselves. The governor, who was better than his caricatures and worse than his press releases, read until the words rearranged themselves into a need. He placed his finger on the line about the dog in the room and then he removed it, not because the line embarrassed him, but because he understood that politics cannot ride openly on the back of what actually changes people. He called for an additional 24 hours and the specific opening of a box in a courthouse basement with an evidence tag that had not been touched since the year of the trial. DNA had learned new languages since then. Tape had become less adhesive. Men had kept sleeping and waking, the majority of them doing both faithfully enough to deserve a day like this. In the prison, none of this had yet acquired a voice. It moved in the building like weather shifting behind walls, felt before explained. Elias sensed it because his days had trained him to hear the difference between footsteps and footsteps with a purpose. He did not quicken. He returned a library book in exchange for a different one with diagrams, exploded views of carburetors, little universes that trusted tiny tolerances to carry combustion like a secret carried correctly. He traced the drawings with a finger and thought about the difference between tight and true again. Tight breaks. True lasts. Men on the tier gathered their courage in forms that would not be recognized by history, but would be recognized by God. One wrote a letter to a daughter he had avoided writing to for a decade because avoidance had become his religion. Another returned a tray he had not stolen. A third used a word other than the one he had been using for his own name, a word that suggested a beginning rather than a label. When a story's center shifts, the perimeter learns to behave. The warden received the call about the box and the hold and did not sit down. He had spent an entire career regarding anything that smelled like mercy as a management problem. He now recognized that what had entered his building was not mercy alone. It was accuracy pressing its claim. He walked to the window and looked at a yard that had failed every metaphor except the crudest. It looked no different. This is how change often appears to men trained to see only in bold, invisible until it is undeniable. In a basement where courthouse dust has learned every surname, a clerk pulled a box that coughed when it moved. Inside, items sat in a careful order that had been satisfied with its own righteousness for too long. A lab worker who could name 20 synthetics in the dark lifted swabs and fabric baggies and cataloged labels written by hands that had believed themselves infallible. The chain of custody was held. The science did the thing it had been waiting to do since the trial, speak a language only it could speak with humility. Numbers lined up where once only certainty had stood. Mixed profiles unbraided under newer machines. A partial from a surface long considered indifferent negated an assumption and pointed toward a man whose name had never entered the file. The district attorney's office felt its temperature fall 3 degrees as a computer spat up a hit that had been sleeping in a database nobody remembered to ask last time. None of this reached the cell where Elias sat copying a passage about Venturis, as if he were a monk preserving a liturgy. He looked up when the chaplain arrived, and the look they exchanged contained no theater, no prophecy, only the shared understanding that a current had entered the river and was picking up small boats without tipping them. The chaplain placed on the desk a photograph of a woman standing on a stoop under a sky that believed in itself, and said, with the caution trained into his bones by too many rooms where words have done harm, that a witness had been found who would say what she saw. He added, because hope must be taught to walk on good roads, that science had been invited to speak and seemed, even at the doorway, eager to tell the truth. Elias did not leap toward a future. He allowed the present to widen. He placed both hands flat on the steel and felt the coolness as blessing. If the law decided to turn toward him, he would face it without anger. If it did not, he would continue sanding the edges of the day until the door moved easily for the man next to him. Both outcomes were a life. Only one would let him meet Sparrow again under a sky he could share. He let himself imagine that for a breath and then returned to the labor given to him to do. On the tier, the rumor of science moved more efficiently than any sermon. It acquired the shape men trust. Numbers arriving to sit down beside the yearning they had been powering on their own for years. Even those who have broken their own lives trust a measurement that isn't trying to sell them anything. The anger that had been rehearsing its monologue in several throats left as if called home to dinner. Returned to administration with the sign statement and the priest's notes and the sister's assurance that Rosa would stand if asked and would not retract even if shouted at. She slid the packet into the aide's cloud and then into the warden's inbox and then, for good measure, into the chaplain's drawer. Redundancy is the elder sibling of faith. If one door closes, another closes more slowly. The handler drove past the prison on her way home and, for the first time since she had taken the job, felt the building look back at her without accusation. She thought of program proposals and training schedules and dogs who would change rooms as if it were sport. She pictured Elias in a class she would one day teach. wearing the patient face of a man who could show a dog what safety looked like because he had once taught it in a one-room apartment with a failing radiator. She allowed herself one impractical thought, that the leash can be a sacrament when used correctly. Evening came with its practiced elegance. The governor received the lab's preliminary with phrases that market themselves to executives: probative value, exclusion, hit. He did not declare a victory. He requested a path. The district attorney, who knew the difference between being right and being attached to having been right, told her staff to stop standing in their own way. A call went out to a public defender who had memorized the location of every bruise the system had left on his state, and had been waiting for this kind of bruise to blossom into a chance. The warden walked the tier one more time, and this time let his eyes do what he had trained them not to do: be witnesses instead of policemen. He saw men reading as if the words had been written that day. He saw a fight refuse to occur. Both men stepping back in choreography no one had taught them. He saw the young guard return a confiscated magazine after deciding the world would survive such contraband, and the inmate receive it with a nod that contained the germ of mutuality. He stopped at Elias's door and did not open the slot. He simply stood there, a shape that had learned to admit regret. He moved on. Night washed the city with a cloth dampened in the river. The child breathed the contentment of the tenderly protected. Sparrow thumped a leg against a dream and woke, looked at the boy, and slept again, now that his audit of the moment had passed. In the cell, Elias set his palm on the desk and then on his chest and then on the little archive of mercy. He did not know what the morning would carry with it when it came. He knew only that rooms can be changed by the entrances they permit. Yesterday had permitted a dog. Today had permitted a woman's name and science's humility. Tomorrow, he suspected, would ask the same question all real tomorrows ask: are you ready to be changed again? He answered before sleep with the only sentence his life could responsibly offer. He would be ready to repair whatever the next door required: hinge, handle, frame, or the person who insisted on slamming it. And if the door opened not for him but for a better arrangement of justice, he would step aside and applaud without sound. He slept, not the sleep of the acquitted, which is a public thing, but the sleep of the aligned, which is private and durable and worth, finally, the cost of every practiced breath. Offices did not sleep. Paper moved, yes, found pens, and the box that had coughed in the basement learned to tell a new story under a different light. Somewhere near midnight, a printer whispered out a single page with a single line that, translated into human terms, meant what the title had promised from the beginning. They thought it was just a prisoner's last wish, but what had walked into the room had been changed itself, and it had not left when the dog did. Morning began without permission. It didn't rise. It arrived heavy and gray, pouring itself into the spaces between sleep and sentence. Inside the prison, light touched everything but warmed nothing. The old rhythm, the one built on rules not reasons, tried to resume, but something invisible had shifted the beat. In cell 3 East, Elias Ward woke before the buzzer again. Habit had trained him to open his eyes to silence, but today the silence was crowded. It was filled with questions he hadn't asked in years, questions about what happens when a story stops obeying its ending. He sat up and stared at the small photograph on his desk. Sparrow and the boy under the sun. The image had gathered fingerprints. His, the chaplain's, maybe even the guard's when he had once set it down to move his tray. He brushed the corners gently, as though afraid to erase any trace of proof that the world still contained soft things. The chaplain appeared at his door without ceremony. He didn't bring a Bible this time, just a face that had been carrying too many unspoken messages. "They've reopened the file," he said quietly. "The evidence is being retested." Elias blinked slowly, as though the words were light and his eyes hadn't adjusted yet. He didn't ask what that meant. He'd spent too long in places where meanings had expiration dates. He simply nodded and whispered, "If the truth still remembers my name, that's enough." The chaplain left him with that line. Some sentences don't need audiences, they just need to exist in the air once, to make the world a fraction lighter. Outside, the corridors carried rumors in their usual way. Half heard, half believed, half hoped. But this rumor felt different. It didn't travel like gossip, it moved like weather. It had pressure. Men who hadn't spoken in months now greeted each other. A few prayed in ways they hadn't dared since childhood, not for themselves, but for the idea that justice might still be awake somewhere. The young guard, Ethan, walked his route slower than usual. He stopped at Elias's door and spoke softly. They say it's real. That the test showed something. He wasn't supposed to share that. But prisons are made of secrets pretending to be schedules. Elias didn't answer. He didn't trust miracles until they learned to walk without stumbling. He just looked up and said, "Thank you, son." Ethan swallowed hard. It wasn't the word thank you that hit him, it was son. No one had called him that in years, not since before his father had stopped coming home sober. He nodded, trying not to show heat in his eyes, then walked away before the word could follow him. Beyond those walls, the retest had indeed spoken. A technician had watched the machine print out its rows of decimals, unbothered by the weight of what they meant. The DNA traces from the fabric bag that once condemned Elias Ward now told a different story, one that named another man. A man already serving time for a similar crime in another county. The result wasn't enough yet to rewrite history, but it was enough to make history hesitate. The district attorney, a woman who had learned to mistrust her own certainty after a lifetime of rewarding it, read the report twice. Her hand stayed still on the table. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just whispered, "We might have been wrong." Across from her, the aide who had started the chain of motion by forwarding a dog report now watched as the machinery of law began to turn in the opposite direction. "We have a statement," he said, placing Rose's signed declaration on the desk. "And a witness willing to testify." The DA nodded, her jaw tightening the way it does when a truth finally finds the courage to arrive late. "Then we start over." Back in the prison, Elias sat cross-legged on his bunk, staring at the small light that hung from the ceiling. He wasn't thinking about release. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about the word again. He'd learned to distrust that word. In his life, again had always been a thief. Again another arrest, again another lie. Again another hope that broke its own spine halfway through the jump. But now the word felt different. It sounded like breath returning. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "If I see the sky without bars again, I'll find Sparrow first. Not to reclaim him, just to say thank you for keeping me human." That same hour, the chaplain met with the warden in the small office that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. Papers were stacked neatly, the way guilt sometimes stacks itself to look like control. "They'll need him in court if the motion passes," said the chaplain. The warden didn't look up. "If the motion passes," he repeated, as though saying it twice made it less possible. The chaplain leaned forward. "It's not just about this man. It's about this place. If he walks out innocent, it means we were wrong to believe redemption was only for the guilty." The warden's eyes flickered, just for a second, and that second was enough. He didn't answer. He just turned the paper over, as if the act itself were an agreement. Outside, life continued to fold itself into its ordinary shape. Rosa sat at her sister's table, hands trembling around a cup of coffee that refused to cool. She hadn't expected anyone to call her again about that night. "I saw him fix the fan. I saw him leave before the noise," she told the chaplain over the phone. "And I didn't speak because I was afraid of being found." "Fear is honest," the chaplain said, "but silence can outlive guilt. It's time it rests." She nodded, crying without the violence of it. "Tell him I'm sorry it took so long." "I will," the chaplain promised. That promise reached Elias through the air long before the words did. He didn't need to hear them to recognize their arrival. Some forgivenesses move through unseen corridors before they knock. By evening, the building began to hum with the strange energy of waiting. Officers who had long ago stopped caring about what's right now found themselves checking news feeds. Inmates whispered through vents like old radios. Even the chaplain prayed with his hands open instead of folded, as if catching something that might fall. In his cell, Elias didn't move for a long time. The air had grown heavy, like the pause before a door decides to open. He thought about Sparrow, the way he'd walked into that room, calm, sure, almost sacred. The way his paw had rested on Elias's knee, not as pity but as partnership. He whispered again, "You brought me this far, didn't you, old friend?" He smiled faintly, realizing how absurd it must sound to speak to memory as if it still breathed. But the room answered him anyway, in its own language. Somewhere beyond the bars, thunder rolled, the kind that sounds like two clouds forgiving each other. Elias looked toward the door, his breath slow and steady. "Whatever happens," he said softly, I'll meet it the way you met me, without fear. Outside, rain began. Inside, for the first time in years, he slept without counting seconds. The next day, the world arrived early. It wore shoes that squeaked down the hall and badges that looked heavier than they should. Papers were signed, copies stamped, and phones buzzed like insects under a low sky. A motion had been approved. The stay extended. Not as mercy but as correction. The court had ordered a full review. When the chaplain walked into Elias's cell, his expression carried something. Officially. Elias stood slowly, his hands trembling. Reopening? He repeated, almost whispering the syllables. Yes. With evidence. With witnesses. With time. He exhaled sharply. His knees nearly gave out, not from weakness, but from disbelief finding its footing. For years he had learned to breathe as though the world might break if he took too much air. Now for the first time he took a full breath and didn't apologize for it. He turned toward the small window at the corner of his cell. It was still covered with bars, but something about the light felt different. It didn't seem like a visitor, it felt like a guest. Chaplain, he said quietly, if this is the truth catching up, tell it. I'll wait. I waited this long, I can wait one more day. The chaplain smiled gently. It's already closer than you think. In the administration wing, S reviewed every line of paperwork she had touched, every box she had moved. For years she had believed her job was to guard the past from chaos. Today she realized that sometimes the past is the chaos, and order begins only when it's undone. She called the aide, her voice steady. He's innocent, isn't he? I can't say that, he replied carefully. Not until the hearing. She paused, then said, then say this instead, we might be. At the shelter, Sparrow rested near the boy's bed. The child was drawing on the back of an old report card, crayon lines forming shapes that made sense only to him. This is you, he said, pointing to a brown circle with 2 ears. And this is your friend, the man from the picture. The mother looked over, startled. Where did you? The one who fixed the door, the boy interrupted. You said he helped you once. The mother froze. She hadn't realized she'd ever told that story. But she had years ago in passing about the man who'd fixed their door for free, who had smiled at her boy and told him, doors only stay closed if we forget they were made to open. Her hand covered her mouth. She stared at Sparrow, whose head had lifted as though remembering something. The dog tilted his head, ears forward, the faint tremor of recognition rising like a tide. That night the news broke quietly. Not as headlines but as whispers, the kind that move faster than truth itself. Convict's case reopened after new evidence emerges. It wasn't enough for the world to celebrate, but it was enough to make it pause. In homes, in offices, in the quiet corners of small towns, people read the line and moved on. But somewhere a few didn't. They stopped, looked at their own hands, and wondered what they might still have the power to undo. Inside the prison, the sound of footsteps returned. Steady, official, unavoidable. The door opened, and Elias knew it wasn't for breakfast. Ward, said the guard. They need you in the conference room. He stood. No cuffs. No chains. Just the open hallway, gleaming faintly in the fluorescent half-light. He followed, every step deliberate, as though walking on new ground. When he entered the room, he saw the chaplain, the warden, and a man in a gray suit whose eyes had seen too many verdicts. Papers waited on the table, some stamped, some still blank. Mr. Ward, said the man in the suit, you've been granted a review hearing. We'll take you to the courthouse tomorrow. Elias didn't move. He stared at the papers, then at the window, then back at the men. Tomorrow, he repeated. You know, that used to sound like a threat. The warden looked down. The chaplain looked up. And in that small triangle of silence, something greater than procedure began to breathe again. Elias placed his hand flat on the table, steady and calm. Then let's do what the truth should have done the first time. That night he couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of memory. He remembered Sparrow's fur, the softness under his palm. He remembered the boy's laughter echoing in his mind. He remembered the smell of home, coffee, old wood, and forgiveness. He whispered to the dark. If I walk out of here, I'll walk straight to him. I won't take him away. I just want to see him run. The darkness didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Somewhere beyond the razor wire, Sparrow lifted his head from sleep, eyes wide open, tail thumping once against the floor. as if he had heard his name in a dream and understood that the waiting was almost over. Morning arrived carrying metal and paper. Vans idled with a low, practical growl. The sky wore courthouse gray, the shade bureaucracies prefer when they intend to change everything without admitting drama. Inside, Elias dressed the way a man dresses for a truth he has waited years to meet, precisely without ornament, allowing no thread to betray the order he had built in himself. He touched each item in his small altar: photograph, child's scrawl, administrator's note. The young guards folded, dignity visible too. The corridor opened before him not as a tunnel but as a road, and his feet remembered how to belong to ground that led somewhere. The chaplain walked near but not beside him, the way a lighthouse keeps its distance and still guides. The courthouse was a memory palace for certainty. Polished floors, flags rehearsed into posture, clocks set to impress upon ordinary time the proper respect for punctuality. Yet even here a draft moved through the hall, the kind of air that finds its way in when doors have been open for too long to keep pretending they are walls. People noticed without saying so: clerks who straightened their backs, officers who let their hands undecide themselves, a receptionist who stopped tapping her pen and listened to the building like you listen to a seashell and admit a whole ocean might be involved. The file came in first, borne by hands that had learned not to shake in front of consequence. Lab reports sat on top like a new translation of an old book. Beneath them, Rose's statement, its ink steady as courage that has finally chosen where to live. The district attorney read with the concentration of a woman who had begun her career believing in sharp lines, and now honored smudges where human truth bled through. She placed the pages in an order that did not flatter her office but respected the day. Elias entered the room that had once compressed him into a single word, defendant, and felt his breath remain in his body. He let it travel slowly, a guest at a table that had not, previously, known his name. He took in the geography, the bench that had once been a mountain, the tables where people had constructed narratives with expensive tools, the gallery where strangers had tried on opinions like coats picked up in Lost and Found. He did not hate the room. He recognized it as a machine that, poorly calibrated, can injure even when it intends to work. The hearing began without ceremony. Courts prefer sequence to spectacle, and sequence was what today required. Evidence first, the machine speaking its exact, humble language about alleles and matches and exclusions and the way a partial can, in the right light, tell the truth a whole had concealed. The numbers marched in lines that would have bored a less desperate audience. Today they performed a liturgy, then a memory human and fragile, asked to be heard. Rosa stood in a suit borrowed from a sister and told the present what the past had tried to leave behind: a blue jacket, a fan repaired, a wave through a door at the hour the crime had occurred in a different grid of the city. She did not ornament. She did not argue. She placed details on the table like tools, each one meant to fix a precise misalignment. Fear, which had kept her obedient to silence, stayed home for the day out of respect. The public defender, a man who had learned to sheath his own outrage inside composure that traveled better, did not preen or perform. He arranged facts as if setting a hinge, showing how doors swing correctly when aligned. Across from him, the DA let the day work. She asked questions that clarified rather than trapped, and when it was her turn to speak about the lab, she did not hedge. Accuracy, finally invited, often arrives with relief so profound it looks like grief. Through it all, Elias practiced the discipline that had saved him more times than his record would suggest: attention without ownership. He watched the faces the way a carpenter watches wood for knots. He recognized the moment when the room's posture changed, when the bench leaned toward correction, when the gallery, which had come to witness a curiosity, shifted into witnessing a reckoning. The judge did what judges do when the future hums under the floorboards. He listened again to the parts that mattered most and let lesser urgencies sit in their chairs without speaking. He saw that the old conviction, once stout as a pillar, had learned to wobble under the weight of better information. He named what the law allows to be named when the law remembers its humility, that a verdict may be vacated when the foundation proves unsound, that the state may concede error without dissolving into chaos, that a life can be restored to presumption not by magic, but by maintenance done thoroughly at last. By afternoon, words with sharp edges were sheathed. A stay extended had become a vacator granted, a phrase so formal it felt like stone and yet, in practice, behaved like water pouring a man back into his own shape. The order did not declare innocence. It declared the previous certainty unfit to house a human being. It opened the door in procedure's name and quietly left it ajar for justice to walk through with less paperwork later. Elias did not cheer. He did not fall. He placed his hand flat against his chest and felt what the lab had proven and the witness had begun. That truth can arrive late and still be on time to save what is left. The chaplain's eyes shone the way windows do after rain. The D exhaled not satisfaction, but relief that a system she had given her life to had, today, behaved as if it might be worthy of that life. Outside, the air had found its weight again. The steps of the courthouse, which had carried countless exits disguised as ends, waited to carry a beginning. Cameras gathered at a respectful distance because the day had been written with verbs that do not produce headlines easily: review, reconsider, vacate, release. Inside, a clerk stamped a final page and slid it across a wood grain that had survived 10 administrations and most kinds of weather. The stamp did not thunder. It clicked, small as a key turning where a lock has finally accepted the cut. Elias left the room accompanied by officers who, for the first time in his memory, felt less like shepherds and more like neighbors, men who happened to know the way out and were willing to walk it with him. His feet found the corridor and then the light. The sky did not roar. It took him in as if he had been expected and they were making room at a table for which his name card had been set, face down, years ago. He did not stop on the steps. He paused at the bottom to give his lungs an honest argument with air, and to let his eyes absorb the unbarred distance. The world had not become kinder in his absence. It had become itself, loud, contradictory, busy with errands, equally capable of generosity and indifference. He forgave it for everything it was not because today it had managed to be this. A car door clicked. A streetlight decided to stay off. The city arranged itself around a man returning to it not with a claim of innocence, not with a demand for restitution, but with the simple intention to be useful to whatever needed fixing next. He thought then not of speeches or statements, but of a porch, a boy, and a dog whose head tilted toward every sound that sounded like his name. He did not run. He chose instead to walk with the pace of a man who trusts that what matters will not flee if he refuses to chase it. The release was not a ceremony. It was a sequence of small permissions strung together by people who, for once, did not drop any. Paper cross-counters. Signatures arrived on lines that had been empty too long. A bracelet of plastic and a number returned to a box. A gate yielded, not theatrically, but like an argument that has been losing for hours and finally sits down. Outside the fence, the chaplain waited without a plan and the administrator, stood a few paces back holding a folder she did not intend to open. The young guard, Ethan, had traded shifts, an act no schedule manager could quite explain, and parked 2 blocks away, where he could witness without becoming the story. The handler idled by the curb in a shelter van that smelled of clean blankets and biscuits. She had not been asked to come. She came anyway because some days ask you to show up in plain clothes with your hands empty. Elias stepped through the last rectangle of shadow into afternoon. He faced the sun without flinching. The chaplain approached and stopped at a polite distance, recognizing that the first minutes of a returned life need more horizon than company. Lifted a hand in a small economical greeting, a ledger offering what apology cannot: accuracy. Ethan, from his distance, let his head drop in a nod that was half prayer, half salute. The handler watched the man who had written the request that had tugged at a thread and thought about leashes again, how sometimes their only correct use is to hang by the door unused. There are 2 kinds of first steps in freedom, the kind that gallops and the kind that listens. Elias chose listening. The world spoke at once. The loaded truck gear shifting at the corner, a bicycle chain arguing with itself, shoes on pavement, laughter stitched to a conversation he could not see. He calibrated. He did not look backward. The gate behind him made its old sound, a little embarrassed by its own importance now. He had no suitcase, no wallet, no keys. He had a folded photograph and a plan so modest it could be mistaken for impulse. Find the dog, not to claim, not to rewrite, but to witness the continuation he had been allowed to begin. The handler, reading the plan without being told, eased the van to the curb and opened the passenger door. Elias glanced at the chaplain. The chaplain's smile said the only liturgy he trusted now: go. The city passed like a documentary whose narrator has decided to shut up and let the images work. Faded murals promise futures no one had been paid to deliver. A playground in need of paint hosted a joy so defiant it looked like policy. Elias watched without greed, hoarding nothing, allowing the love he felt for what continued without him to arrive without asking it to justify itself to him. At a row of houses the van slowed. Flower pots leaned. A porch confessed to having lived a winter honestly. Inside, a boy inventing a world in crayon looked up before footsteps sounded. Sparrow lifted his head with the precision of a compass remembering north. The handler did not move. She was a hinge today, designed to allow and not to decide. Elias stopped at the bottom of the steps. He did not mount them. He removed the photograph and held it at his side like identification for a country that had no borders except kindness. The mother appeared first, not surprised so much as readied. The way you are when a story you thought had ended knocks politely and asks whether the last page can be reconsidered. She measured the man, the porch, the air, all of it aligned. She opened the door wider. An invitation that admitted boundaries. The boy hovered with an attention that did not require explanation. Sparrow came forward at a pace that spared dignity on both sides. There are reunions that set off fireworks and there are reunions that reshape gravity. This was the second kind. Sparrow approached as an elder greets an elder, nose low, ears half back, tail performing a conversation that preferred understatement. Elias extended his hand as if requesting a library book he had once loved. The dog's breath found his skin and named him more efficiently than any court. The weight of a head settled against his knee. A tremor, tiny as forgiveness learning to trust itself, passed between them and kept going, into the boards of the porch, into the van, into the street where a passerby slowed without knowing why and then walked on softer. Elias did not cry. He had spent tears in other currencies and learned that this economy of feeling was better served by breath. He gave Sparrow both hands and then he gave him space. He greeted the boy with a nod so full of respect it made room for the child to be brave. The mother felt her house stretch by one seat to accommodate history without allowing it to evict the present. Boundaries remained. Blessing did too. He did not enter. He did not ask. He witnessed, received, and returned what was being offered. The knowledge that the life he had rescued once had flourished without him, and that counted as a win. They walked man and dog and boy down one length of sidewalk and back. That much was permitted by manners and by the unspeaking contract adults make in neighborhoods that save their tenderness for when it matters. Sparrow moved with the glad caution of an old friend who refuses to sprint in case the world cannot keep up. Elias matched him stride for stride, their shadows remembering how to share space without tripping. When it was time to leave, the leave-taking learned from the reunion muted, exact, refusing to burn what it had just built. Elias knelt once, pressed his forehead to Sparrow's, and let the world turn around them without commentary. He stood and placed a palm over the dog's chest the way he had done in the visitation room, a sacrament repeated under open sky. He thanked what could be thanked without words. He stepped back first. Love, properly handled, answers to courtesy. The handler drove him next to a shelter office where paper would again be required, this time for him, temporary lodging, a clean shirt, a phone with too many choices, a schedule that included the hearing to set the next hearing. S arrived with a folder he did not have to open because she had already translated most of it into sentences he could carry without needing to remember the whole alphabet. The chaplain produced a key to a borrowed room above a storefront that preached repair in its window simply by existing. Evening came and brought with it the itch of free time. Freedom is not only release from, it is also responsibility to. Elias walked the block where his room lived and counted what needed fixing as if someone had asked him to bid the job. A hinge crying for oil, a railing that would send a child to the ground if not shored, a step whose rot had only just confessed. He made a list on a page torn from the back of the manual he had kept so long it felt like scripture. He knocked at the first door the next morning. It would be convenient not to announce a savior, but to ask whether a neighbor might take a look. News did what news does, moved in waves, brought too many opinions to tables designed for fewer. The headline borrowed the dog again because the dog was the only part of the story that did not argue with itself. Last wish visit leads to case reopened. Conviction vacated pending review. Inside the articles, numbers sat where drama wanted to sit. On comment lines, strangers shouted their private wars into each other's kitchens. It did not reach him in that form. What reached him were the things that travel faster than outrage. A bag of hand-me-downs in better shape than the label claims. A sandwich shoved at him by a woman who insisted she had made too many on purpose. A nod from a man on the corner that meant, "You are seen, behave accordingly." When night returned, He lay on a mattress that did not remember him and taught it, gently, the shape he planned to sleep in. He set the photograph on the crate beside the bed and the child's note beneath it, and the administrator's 3 lines above his heart. He thought of the dia recalibrating, the aide forming memos out of Mercy's moving parts, the warden walking his building with new ears, the young guard closing a microwave softly, the handler drafting a pilot program that would one day issue vests to dogs who would go to work where sirens used to go alone. He did not ask the future for promises. He asked it for tasks. In the morning he would look for a screwdriver, a level, a tin of oil. He would visit the courthouse again and allow more paper to do its penance. He would stand ready to tell what he had learned about doors, that they stick in humidity and must be sanded where no one sees, that they slam when men are frightened and can be taught to close softly, that they open in the end not because you kick them, but because you know where the hinge needs care. Sleep found him at last, and finding him worth the trouble, stayed. Somewhere across town a dog dreamed without trembling, a boy slept with one hand on a collar, and a city allowed itself to imagine that some of its worst habits could be replaced with better ones if enough hands kept choosing the right tools. The title had promised that a last wish would change everything. It had, and it hadn't. The law remained itself. The world remained unruly. But in the rooms where men breathe and decide, something had been added to the inventory, proof that love, correctly deployed, is a system change disguised as a reunion. More acts remained: restitution, rebuilding, the long education of a man returning to an untidy freedom. But Act 5 closed on a quiet fact sturdy enough to carry them. The door had opened, and this time it had decided to stay on its hinges. Morning in freedom behaved differently. It did not shout at the walls or arrive as a schedule stapled to a door. It drifted in through thin curtains with the modesty of light learning a new room. Elias woke before it finished arriving, out of habit, and lay still while the city practiced its scales below his window. Delivery trucks negotiating corners, bicycles arguing with potholes, a vendor testing his voice against the block. His borrowed room contained 3 declarations: a bed with clean sheets, a crate for a table, and a single nail in the wall that asked to be useful. He hung nothing on it yet. Some promises need to stand in the air a few days before they accept weight. He began his first morning with the only liturgy that had never abandoned him: order. Blankets squared. Corners smoothed. Books aligned. Photographs set where eyes could find it without effort. The picture of Sparrow pressed its quiet against the new day, not as a request but as a calibration. Outside the window a child rehearsed laughter. He allowed the sound to enter without defense. The city introduced itself in layers. The sidewalk spoke first, grainy underfoot, scuffed by shoes that had no interest in telling their stories. A bakery door breathed sweetness into the street and closed itself gently as if proud of its manners. Sunlight wrote a temporary invitation on every window and erased it by noon. Elias walked with the posture of someone who refused to steal from any moment. Shoulders at peace, eyes taking inventory without hunger, hands empty and unconcerned with proving it. Paperwork followed, faithful as shadow. Identification had to be coaxed out of archives that mispronounced his name. A temporary voucher studied him from behind glass and decided he was not dangerous to the laminate. An application requested histories he no longer owned. He offered the truth he had, and clerks translated it into shapes their forms recognized. At every counter there was a person, and in each person a judgment and a mercy, and on good hours the mercy remembered how to win. He learned the new choreography of lines, the patience of numbers, the soft arithmetic of taking turns, the way a chair can become sanctuary in a waiting room if you sit in it like you belong to days that continue. Hunger was an honest part of the routine. Restaurants shouted in colors. He chose a grocery and learned the geography of aisles as if studying a map. The abundance stung. Decisions which had once been sparse and sharp, multiplied into petty infinities. Rice in 10 disguises, soap in 14 cents, bread with more adjectives than a letter can carry. Panic tried its old persuasion at the edge of his vision. He returned to a practice he had learned from Sparrow. Pay attention to what is close and true. He found the weight of the basket in his hand, the temperature of the air on his wrist, the rhythm of his own breath. The world stopped tilting. He chose what a human being needs to keep a day going: eggs, apples, bread that promised nothing but bread, and walked out as if the exit had been designed to recognize him. He began a list. Not of hopes. Of tasks. A hinge on the building's main door needed oil. The rail on the stoop confessed to soft wood with every touch. The light over the stair flickered like a tired prayer. He borrowed a screwdriver from a neighbor who recognized usefulness when it introduced itself, and returned it with a tightened world. Work, modest and visible, mapped his hours into a sequence the heart could trust. On the second afternoon he took the bus to the shelter district, not for sentiment but for orientation. The handler had left a message with no pressure inside it, just direction. He showed up and did not ask for anything but a broom. The air inside the kennels carried the music of creatures that refused to speak in human tongues, and still managed to tell the truth. He learned names he would not repeat to keep from becoming responsible for what he could not yet keep. He scrubbed, rinsed, squeegeed, and let the simple arithmetic of clean and dry convince the day it mattered. There, among the noise, a quiet presented itself. The steady work of animals reminding broken people that rhythms exist that cannot be performed badly. A nervous terrier taught him again the patient geometry of approach, body angled away, eyes averted, presence offered and withdrawn, heartbeat slowed into invitation. He found himself applying the same lessons to human rooms. Stand near without crowding, let silence tell you where the door is. The chaplain visited in the evenings, never at the same hour, as if to teach that comfort does not have to wear routine to be trusted. They spoke less than they breathed. The administrator sent envelopes that contained fewer instructions than options. Phone numbers arrived for clinics that treated time like a wound, for offices that helped debt accept its limits, for a shop that hired men who remembered what tools were for. He arranged the slips of paper on the crate and sorted them not by urgency but by integrity, work that made something true, people who behaved like neighbors, doors that opened without expecting him to kneel. News traveled in ways he could ignore if he chose. Headlines tried to fasten themselves to his name. He refused to stabilize them. The district attorney requested patience while accuracy continued its work. The public defender rehearsed the second act of paperwork's conversion into mercy. He let them move in their spheres while he moved in his own. Stoops, hinges, light bulbs, leashes, brooms. Money arrived poorly and left without superstition. A landlord insisted on a deposit compassion could not conjure. A pastor covered part without making a ceremony of the handoff. A neighbor paid him in cash and gratitude for a door that now closed softly. He took both and offered back an explanation of how to sand the hidden edge when humidity returned. Exchange learned to move without shame. Night brought old habits to check the windows. He met them at the threshold and offered them newer ones. A cup of tea, pages about small engines whose diagrams soothe the part of his mind that trusts things that fit, a practice list written at the end of each day. What had been received, what had been offered, what had remained unbroken. Sleep, suspicious at first, learned to occupy the room without locking it. On the fourth morning he found a jacket folded in a paper bag on his doormat, plain, well-made, blue. No card. The bag smelled faintly of laundry soap and a garage. He knew the signature anyway. A young guard's attempt at saying what his throat had refused to say. He put the jacket on and discovered it knew his shoulders without needing to be taught. Gratitude recorded the moment and then released it, because greed can wear humble clothes and still be greed. The world's insistence on speed pressed against him and slid off. He was a man who had built an engine of patience inside a factory of urgency. He did not apologize. When neighbors apologized for their rooms, he showed them which screws to turn. When a woman hesitated to ask, he nodded toward the broken thing and let the nod be permission. When a child watched, he angled the work so small hands could see why something stayed where it was put when fitted properly. At the end of the first week, the handler asked for a tryout that wasn't called that. A group of men in a facility across town would benefit if the dogs they were preparing for adoption learned to trust hands that had reason not to trust themselves. Elias arrived as a pair of eyes and left as a set of hands, calm, precise, willing to be patient longer than fear could be loud. He showed a shepherd mix how to sit for a bowl by waiting until the dog remembered that food in a safe room arrives whether you hurry it or not. He showed a man how to hold a leash without carrying his past through it. He did not announce a philosophy. He did not name a program. He let repetition do the gentle vandalism of old habits. By the time the second Sunday folded itself toward evening, the room above the storefront contained more than a bed and a crate. It contained a life that could be asked to continue. A screwdriver waited in a coffee tin. A schedule for the week sat under a magnet shaped like a lighthouse the chaplain had left without comment. The photograph of Sparrow and the boy lived on the crate, and beside it lay a smaller square the mother had sent without fanfare. The same porch at dusk, a glass of water on the rail, a dog asleep in a way only safety teaches. He studied the two images the way a navigator studies stars, not to own them but to find out where he was. He ended the seventh day with a sentence that did not need to be spoken to be true. Freedom had not erased anything. It had asked for practice. He would continue to practice until the hinges of his days stopped sticking where no one could see. The second week began with the old trickster time switching its costume. Hours did not glare anymore. They drifted, and drifting can be dangerous for men who have learned to tie themselves to tasks to avoid falling through their own surfaces. Elias countered drift with routes. Mornings belonged to repairs, stoops, stairs, storefront bells that had learned to lie about customers. Afternoons belonged to dogs that taught classes no school could schedule. Evenings he saved for the slow work of writing letters he would never send and the slower work of listening to a city try to reinvent itself one block at a time. Work found him in a pattern. First curiosity at an older man kneeling on a neighbor's steps, then respect at the sound a corrected hinge makes, then the question every neighborhood eventually learns to ask about such men: what can you fix next? He kept his price simple: cash if people had it, barter if they didn't. A baker paid in bread. A barber in a careful trim that told the world someone had attended to him. A tailor in a button that finally stopped wandering. He accepted each with a ceremony scaled to fit the object. He learned the ethics of boundaries in a way prison can teach but never requires. He did not stand under Sparrow's windows. He did not choose the same sidewalk without reason. When the boy waved from a distance, he waved back and kept moving so that love could keep its manners. On one afternoon when routes overlapped by accident, he and the dog found themselves sharing a strip of park with nothing between them except air and the very rules that let both breathe. He sat on a bench angled away from familiarity. Sparrow settled in the shade with the ease of an animal that no longer performs reassurance. They listened to the same breeze adjust the trees and let that count as enough. The shelter work thickened into something like vocation without asking for a promise. Dogs learned to surrender alarms they had acquired in rooms without kindness. Men learned to carry leashes like invitations instead of orders. The handler kept notes that turned into a form that turned into a proposal, and she let the proposal keep the quiet heart of the work by refusing to decorate it. A line in a draft carried the simple claim that had started everything: controlled contact reduces harm because beings designed for trust remember how to become themselves when trust is available. The sentence did not boast. It presented a tool. The shop that hired men who remembered what tools were for offered 2 days a week at a bench near the door. The foreman understood what to do with people like Elias: give them a problem and leave them alone long enough to solve it wrong once without penalty. Elias polished brass plates until they remembered to be proud and tuned door closers, so even a rushed person could not make them slam. He left after each shift with the subtle fatigue that comes from repairing rather than merely working. On a Wednesday that arrived with rain and then forgot what to do with it, the district attorney's office slid a message through the chaplain because sometimes the cleanest lane for communication is the one not recorded in any index. The investigation had matured. The new profile had found its match in a man whose file had not noticed Elias's file because files do not make friends. A hearing had been scheduled to move the case from maybe to likely, from vacated to dismissed. No confetti had been ordered. Accuracy never asks for applause. The chaplain carried the message up the back stairs and set it on the crate like a loaf of bread. Elias met the news as he had learned to meet good fortune. With his weight balanced and his hands empty, he acknowledged the shape of the next days without trying to stand in them too early. He did something ordinary instead. He fixed the pull bell on the shop's door and taught it to sing one clean note instead of 2 arguing ones. When the bell obeyed, the foreman grunted with satisfaction without ceremony. Respect in certain trades is a weather report, not a speech. On Thursday night, the room insisted on being small. The day had brought a surprise that wore kindness poorly. A man on a corner who recognized Elias's face from a headline and decided to audition as a judge. The audition lasted a sentence and left the taste of metal in the air. Elias returned to the room and sat on the bed without removing his jacket. Panic applied for work. He denied its application by remembering again what the dog had taught him in smaller rooms: find the close truth. He found the roughness of denim under his fingers, the weight of his body on wood, the exactness of breath when given permission to be counted. The ceiling calmed. He stood and boiled water because boiling is an honest sound, and he drank without punishing himself for needing this kind of medicine. On Friday, the shelter piloted a visit to a halfway house, not for spectacle, but to test whether trust could be exported. Elias joined because he understood that bridges must be walked to prove they are not just drawings. Men with unfinished tempers learned how to speak below a whisper to animals who hated being startled. Dogs learned how to sit for hands that had once only known fists. The room, which had been built for caution, practiced something riskier: care. A supervisor who measured outcomes in quiet hours recorded one and then another and then, almost reluctantly, wrote significant in a column that did not use such adjectives lightly. The weekend belonged to the block. A ladder leaned where a gutter had given up. He persuaded it back into usefulness. A grandmother asked if anyone could make a doorbell admit it had worked once. He made it confess. A teenager knocked shyly and offered a phone with a cracked screen as if presenting a wounded bird. Elias did not know screens the way he knew screws, but he knew logistics and found someone who did, insisting on watching long enough to pay in questions and learn where to send the next kid. Knowledge, he decided, was a tool cabinet, and his job was to keep the drawers labeled. Letters continued. Unsent, unrequired, steady. One, to the mother he addressed every night, told her that Precision had joined the case like a grown child returning to handle the finances. Another, to the anonymous child who slept with one hand in a collar, described the physics of safety as a shared project, a house that learns how to hold its people by being held. He did not mail them. He learned to trust that sincerity is not wasted even when it refuses to perform. The young guard left another bag on the doormat, a pair of work gloves thick enough to respect heat and splinters. The gloves fit the way tools sometimes do when they were made in a factory, by someone who still silently prays for the hands that will wear them. Elias wore them the next morning on a job that required demolition before repair, and remembered that some fixes insist on removing rot first, even when the neighborhood loves the sound of hammers less than the sight of paint. The city showed its teeth and then, out of fairness, showed its open palm. He encountered both without pretending not to notice. A man asked for money in a voice rehearsed into boredom. Elias offered food instead and directions to a place where boredom could become sleep. A woman moved her purse when he sat, then moved it back when a child pointed and said his name with a tone learned from screen captions. He forgave both transactions and walked on. When the second Sunday arrived, the room no longer felt borrowed. It felt entrusted. He hung one thing on the nail at last: a level, the small horizontal truth-teller that keeps frames honest. It was a joke to anyone else, to him it was a creed. He touched it before leaving and found comfort in the bubble's obedience. That afternoon the handler called with a sentence that had more work in it than words. The pilot was being named and funded. The prison had agreed. The warden had signed. The chaplain had promised to do the part no form can do. A Dog and Man program would begin where sorrow had set up its office. Long ago. Elias listened and did not move. Then he moved, slowly, as if approaching a shy animal, and allowed himself to believe that a visit had become a bridge and a bridge had become a road and the road now asked to be used. He returned to the park where air remembered his name and sat on the same bench angled against nostalgia. Across the grass, the boy tossed a ball made friendly by dirt. Sparrow trotted, not to chase but to accompany, the way old joys refused to hurry. Elias watched, not to own but to honor. He placed his hand on his chest where the dog's paw had rested in the room that had changed everything and quietly agreed to spend the rest of his useful days teaching hinges, on doors, on leashes, in hearts, to move the way they were designed, quietly, reliably, toward open. Night gathered without negotiation. He wrote his last list of the week: receive, offer, repair, repeat. He added a new word at the bottom: return, and understood it now as something other than going back. It meant sending goodness through the same corridors that had once delivered harm, and insisting it be signed for at the other end. Sleep accepted the terms. The city settled. In a building across town, a storage closet opened for boxes labeled with a program name no poet would ever choose and no bureaucrat could resist. In a room under a small roof, a level hung on a nail and kept still as breath. And somewhere in a house that had learned to enlarge itself without breaking, a dog slept with the confidence of a creature who has twice been delivered, while a boy dreamed their future without knowing he was doing so. The next act waited at the courthouse, in a room that would decide whether to write the final correction in the file or to ask for another paragraph. Elias set his boots by the door, palms flat on tomorrow's table, and prepared once more to arrive not as a headline, but as a man who knows how to fix what wobbles. Morning arrived with a discipline that felt rehearsed, and yet the city moved as if it knew the choreography would be different today. Clouds arranged themselves into quiet tiers above the courthouse dome, a gray that did not threaten. It steadied. Buses sighed, doors parted, shoes negotiated curbs. The world did what it always does, but underneath its ordinary there was a slower frequency, an almost audible hum, announcing that a ledger was about to be balanced in public. Elias woke in darkness a few minutes before dawn and allowed the room to become itself around him. The mattress, the crate, the level on the nail, the photograph that anchored his mornings, all stood where he had left them, as if instructed overnight to hold their posts. He washed, dressed, and sealed the small altar into memory with his palm, the child's note tucked behind the photo, the administrator's careful lines, the folded thanks from a young guard who had learned how to carry softness without apology. He buttoned the jacket that had arrived in a paper bag, felt the fabric settle across his shoulders, and recognized the sensation for what it was, a weight that supported rather than pressed down. The city lifted him toward the courthouse in increments, stairs, sidewalks, bus steps, thresholds, each a test the body passed without supervision. He watched corners he had memorized as a younger man surrender their old meanings. The bakery door that breathed sugar into the street no longer represented a longing to belong, it offered hospitality without charge. A barber's pole spun, daring him to measure time. He refused and time relented. A schoolyard exhaled children, and he counted their laughter the way navigators count stars. Not to own them, but to locate himself by something trustworthy. Inside the courthouse air wore polish. Flags stood in their accustomed posture. Clocks practiced their sternness for the benefit of those who needed reminding. Yet beneath the formality, another kind of order had arrived, one that did not insist on being noticed. Clerks moved with competence wrongly mistaken in other rooms for indifference. Officers behaved like furniture that had been returned to the corners where it belonged. Paper traveled without theatrics. Signatures found their lines like water finding its level. He entered the courtroom as a man who had already stood here once as an object, and now returned as a witness to what institutions do when they remember their purpose. The bench elevated a human being into a role. The role looked back on the human being and asked for humility. The gallery filled with faces not recruited by appetite but by duty. Journalists who had learned to write without sharpening the very wounds they described. Neighbors whose eyes had practiced gentleness. Staff who understood that their tasks could function as sacraments on days like this. Evidence arrived on carts, in binders, as pages that did not raise their voices. The science that had waited in a basement found its daylight. Machines that never aimed to be heroic did their work without complaint and sent their numbers into the room in quiet rows that argued with nothing but error. Where once there had been certainty arranged as spectacle, there was now accuracy arranged as service. The state, which had once told a story too simple for a life as complicated as his, unlearned it in publicly visible steps. He watched, not as the center of a drama, but as a craftsman observing repairs. A witness's account, exiled by fear and returned by courage, settled into the framework where it had always belonged. A former assumption failed the new load test and was set gently aside. A missing piece from an old puzzle arrived late and clicked without fuss. The room changed posture the way a spine changes when a weight is lifted from it, first disbelief at the relief, then acceptance, then gratitude so deep it does not resemble celebration. The judge's face, which had learned across a career to be both weathered and weatherproof, softened by degrees as the morning lengthened. The district attorney, who had decided that the most honorable use of power is to repair harm done by power, aligned her office's language with what the numbers and the woman's memory demanded. Opposing counsel ceased to be opposing and became companionable, two sides of a bench lifting the same plank together. No one spoke the word miracle. The room did not need it. The word for the day was maintenance. Elias noticed small mercies. A bailiff set a pitcher of water slightly closer to his reach than usual and did not look at him, because kindness sometimes prefers anonymity. A clerk placed an extra copy of a page in the stack not because anyone had requested it, but because experience had taught her where confusion tries to enter, and she refused to let it. A reporter closed a notebook at a moment where drama might have been squeezed from a sentence, and the choice not to squeeze preserved the dignity of everyone present. By midday the scaffolding was complete. The structure the state had once insisted was sound could no longer bear its own claims. The law, remembering that it is a language rather than a deity, articulated the only correction it could support: the previous conviction vacated, the charges dismissed with prejudice, the record corrected to reflect the absence of what had never been present. The words, heavy on paper and light in delivery, altered the density of the room. Breath exited chests it had rented for years. Shoulders fell into new positions that felt at last like home. He did not rise immediately. He allowed the phrases to pass through him, to set their hooks not in adrenaline but in bone. Set their hooks not in adrenaline but in bone. He watched the effect ripple outward, the chaplain's jaw unclenching in that barely perceptible way trained men allow themselves, the administrator's hands loosening from their decades-long grip on other people's tragedies, the handler's eyes warming with the quiet joy reserved for witnesses who prefer their work to their names. Even the young guard, who had stationed himself along a wall like humility in uniform, lost his practiced stillness, and the tremor that found him was not weakness, it was release. When he stood, he did so with the deliberation of a person learning how to inhabit rightful space after a long exile in the cramped hallway of suspicion. The floor returned his weight like a friend. The door remembered how to be a door, not a verdict. The corridor, long and well lit, did not threaten. It invited. He moved through it without hurrying because hurrying would have insulted the care with which the morning had been arranged. Outside, wind lifted the corners of newspapers already printed with yesterday's summaries, and not yet updated to contain today's correction. Traffic performed its indifferent choreography. A child dropped a mitten and a stranger returned it in a gesture so ordinary it glowed. He paused at the bottom of the steps not because cameras gathered, but because he wanted to mark the spot where grief had once claimed dominion and where, today, grief had been asked to step aside. He touched the rail and noted that one of its brackets would need attention soon. The thought soothed him more than any speech could have done. He did not orbit toward microphones. He did not translate the sacred into sound bites. He allowed a single stillness to express what the day required. A man arranged around a spine that had survived mislabeling and now refused to participate in victory poses. A van idled along the curb with purpose that did not announce itself. The handler waited with her hands visible on the wheel, performing the opposite of claim. The chaplain remained at the edge of the frame, available without intruding. The administrator put a folder back into her bag and zipped it as if closing with that simple act, the era that had required her to carry it. He climbed into the van and did not look back at the building. Buildings, like people, find their dignity not by being stared at, but by behaving well when no one watches. He let the city roll toward him in rectangles of windshield. A collage of ordinary promises kept, trash collected, lights timed, dogs walked, doors opening at the right moments for people carrying groceries, bundles, babies, fatigue. They crossed into the neighborhood where leashes teach the opposite of restraint. The shelter's sign met them with its modest ambition. Inside, the world resumed its honest noises, water in stainless bowls, tags tapping against wire, volunteers allocating their energy like nurses with good instincts. He walked the corridor of kennels the way one walks a memorial, neither rushing nor stealing solemnity from the creatures who live there by making the place too precious to function. In the last room, sunlight put a rectangle on the floor. The boy napped in it with the surprise of children whose bodies refused to wait for bedtime to honor exhaustion. Sparrow slept beside him in a curve that had learned the boy's shape, paws twitching as if chasing a memory that had chosen to be kind. The handler gestured and then withdrew the gesture because the room had already understood how to move without instructions. Recognition began before sound. It started as a shift in the density of the air, a rebalancing of the floorboards, an old pattern waking. Sparrow opened his eyes. The years that had grayed his muzzle had not dimmed the intelligence behind his gaze. He stood without rush, looked at the boy to confirm permission not because he needed it but because love acquires manners when it is safe, and then crossed the distance. The path he took was the same as before, the same as always. A direct line softened at the last moment into a lean that ended in the place beneath the sternum where hands instinctively go when you catch your breath. Elias knelt. The body had been storing a particular gravity for a long time, and kneeling made it visible so the room could help him carry it. The dog's head found his chest as if a blueprint had been consulted. The scent of wool and fur and afternoon in old corridors braided together until time forgot its petty rules. The boy woke and did not startle. He smiled with the fragile pride of someone who knows he has been trusted with something the world could not be trusted with for a while. The reunion did not violate any agreements. It did not demand to be called a homecoming, because home had already been arranged where it currently resided and did not need to be dismantled to accommodate history. It was instead a benediction, an anointing of the present with the oil of a past that had been asked to stop injuring the future. The handler looked away and failed. The chaplain closed his eyes and succeeded. The administrator stepped back into the hall to let strangers pass without requiring any of them to become witnesses if they had arrived today without the strength for it. Outside, the sky shifted from courthouse gray to a color that belonged to evenings that keep their promises. Inside, caged doors clicked shut for the night in rhythms that never felt carceral. Food bowls slid into place. The mop made its unglamorous progress and still qualified as grace. A sign-in sheet anchored its corner with a stapler that would outlast a dozen programs and still prefer to be useful rather than praised. When the day released them, the van carried him back through streets that now recognized his weight in the seat. The city had not changed to suit him. It had resumed its broad acceptance of shapes like his. He watched the shops count down their hours, the stoops claim their people, the lights prepare the evening's arrangements. He did not feel the compulsion to consume it. He felt the responsibility to maintain it, piece by piece, so others could pass through without catching on the jagged parts. In his room he set the jacket on the chair and attended to a small failure in the lamp switch that had announced itself 2 nights earlier. He opened it with a precision born from years of practicing care where care was in short supply. The contacts had oxidized. Attention reversed the neglect. The bulb hummed into obedience and then, when turned off, kept a quiet within it that testified to being correctly wired. He returned the screwdriver to its coffee tin and wrote that repair in his ledger beneath the day's larger accounting. System unlearned error. Record mended. Reunion conducted without theft. Before sleep he performed the gesture that had always kept him honest, palm against chest, breath measured into the room, gratitude submitted without request for reply. He dreamed not of absolution, which is an untidy word, but of balance. Hinges aligned, doors closing softly, leashes carried like invitations, corridors bright enough to discourage secrets from multiplying. Morning would have more work to do. The story had not ended. It had changed jurisdictions, from the courthouse to the neighborhood, from broadcast to practice. He closed his eyes prepared to meet it there. Dawn rewrote the skyline with a pencil rather than a pen, as if to remind everyone that the day remains erasable until people choose otherwise. In the administrative core of the city, drafts circulated that would codify what the previous afternoon had already proven, that programs born of experience travel better than press conferences, that animal-assisted calm reduces harm where punishment has failed to, that witness protection must account for poverty if memory is to survive long enough to testify. The district attorney's office recalibrated its posture. Interns printed policies, veterans edited language until it admitted fallibility without inviting chaos. Training decks replaced 3 slides with 6, removing the word closure from one and inserting review into another. Presentations that had once coasted on the comfort of procedures learned to anchor themselves in the discomfort of questions. Faces around those tables remembered the cost of certainty. At the shelter, the pilot that began as a visit acquired a name unfriendly to headlines and perfect for budgets. Dogs that had been learning to trust remained the program's center. Men who had once been reduced to numbers were hired to hold leashes with steadier hands than any curriculum could create. The handler wrote schedules, not manifestos. Her reports kept their clauses modest. Fewer incidents on tiers after sessions, staff sick days trending down, inmates sleeping longer stretches without intervention. Mercy took the shape of metrics to cross the bridges where only metrics are accepted. The warden, who had survived his career by honoring efficiency even when it disguised harm, learned to become suspicious of any graph that rose without asking. He walked his building more than his office demanded. He listened for the low frequency that predicts trouble and between sessions with the dogs found measure by measure that the frequency had shifted. Men who had trained their voices to ride high were learning to descend a register. Doors that had always closed like symbols learned to close like eyelids. He changed nothing dramatically. He altered a calendar and, in doing so, admitted that time is a system lever even executives forget they hold. The young guard returned to his route with a private liturgy. He closed the microwave without slamming it. He greeted the same names with a tone that withheld nothing good. He learned that attention prevents more violence than posture, and he chose attention until it became posture. Twice he interrupted fights by stepping into the room early with a question about something ordinary, mail, food, a repair, and watched the room decide quietly not to escalate. He did not report these as interventions. He counted them as debt paid to the man who had taught him that softness is not the opposite of strength. It is strength with its weapons put down. In a house with a porch that sloped honestly toward the street, a mother altered the way she set dinner. She placed a bowl for the dog first and allowed the boy to oversee the ritual. She did this not out of romance but because the discipline of care at mealtime had taught the child something the school's behavior charts could not. That responsibility tastes better than reward. Sparrow slept beneath the table in the old shape he had learned under a radiator years ago, translating a life's worth of safety into the soft flecks of paws against wood. Elias moved through the second day as if the courtroom's air had been poured into the streets and distributed evenly, thin but palpable. He walked routes he had already earned, stooped to shop to shelter to room, and found them waiting like chapters returning to a story they had refused to give up on while the author was misfiled. Work presented itself at the usual scale: oil here, sand there, tighten, replace, teach, step back, check the swing. People practiced their own repairs quietly, and let his presence rearrange nothing except their estimation of what men like him bring with them when they arrive. He met suspicion without prosecuting it. On a corner where yesterday's paper still shouted the wrong summary of his life, a stranger's eyes performed the calculus that ends with judgment. The calculation completed itself. The stare lifted. The day went on. He allowed the math to stand unrevised because not every error requires correction to be conquered. Some must be outlived. He devoted his energy to tasks that produce satisfaction quicker than public opinion does: a doorbell restored to honesty, a gate that stopped complaining, a shelf that accepted weight and did not slump into apology. Letters continued in the evening, their unmailed sincerity acquiring a discipline that felt monkish. One was addressed to the man the DNA had named, a man who would never read it, and it refused to carry rage. It catalogued harm, honored consequence, and then laid down its pen. Another letter described to the child with the crayon how a city keeps itself whole by distributing care to the edges where people stop looking. A third, just a list of names of men on the tier who had slept through the night during the pilot, laid out not for any reader but for himself, so he would remember that statistics are made of breaths. He visited the park at the hour when dogs teach leashes to be gentle. He chose a bench that did not face the house he did not own and let the evening wash him in evidence that the world proceeds without petitions for applause. Across the grass, Sparrow trotted within the perimeter of safety, never straining, never lagging, the old cadence that prefers companionship to conquest. The boy, perfecting the art of throws that ask only to be returned and not conquered, matched the dog's pace. A wave traveled between them at a distance that kept both dignity and tenderness intact. That small geometry, angles not lines, proximity not possession, became his working diagram for love in the aftermath of miracles. News programs tried to convert the day into cautionary tale or victory lap. He did not watch. He had learned that attention, like tools, dulls when used on the wrong material. Instead, he studied the hinge on his room's window and showed it patience until the squeak that had written itself into the nights agreed to evacuate. In the process, he discovered a hairline crack in the sash and arranged a repair with the landlord that did not exploit either of them. He counted this negotiation as a larger success than any headline, because it suggested how life might look if everyone agreed to remain reparable. The district attorney's office sent word through the chaplain that the paperwork required to finalize what the judge had already announced would take time measured in business days, and not in human hearts. He nodded at the message and refused to quarrel with clocks. The system had done something expensive in public. It would now protect itself by doing something slow in private. He would meet it there as he had met it everywhere else, with attention and without theft. That week, the pilot program introduced a rule written in the practical poetry of people who work in rooms with hard floors. Any man who walks a dog walks himself back to the tier. Any man who keeps pace with a frightened animal gets a pace kept with him when his courage thins. The rule did not require signatures. It required minutes. Men who had failed at epiphanies succeeded at routines. Dogs who had been trained by scarcity accepted plenty without losing their manners. The warden read the early notes and felt a heat in his face he did not attribute to the room. He allowed himself one small correction of his own posture. Less steel, more listening. On Sunday the block organized itself without a meeting. It placed a table on the sidewalk because weather had agreed to be friendly. Bowls appeared. Tools migrated to the middle. The project was small, the kind that rarely gets photographed. A handrail no longer safe for elders. A window screen needing to confess its holes and be replaced rather than patched again. A gutter that had been postponing its collapse. He stood where he was useful and moved when someone else's usefulness surpassed his. When bread arrived, he ate. When a child asked why screws behave better when turned slowly, he showed the child the difference. Behave better when turned slowly. He showed the child the difference between tight and true and watched comprehension light the little face in the old way. That evening the city gave him a gift it seldom offers, an hour without interruptions. He sat in the room that was now more his than borrowed and laid the day beside the week beside the months behind it. He saw the arc the way carpenters see a frame before walls go up, angles that promise holding. The dog walking into the prison had not been a trick for cameras or a loophole for pity. It had been a blueprint unrolled on a table and weighted at the corners by human beings who had agreed to keep it from curling. What they had built together could be inspected, could be maintained. It could be expanded without breaking load-bearing walls. Sleep arrived not as escape but as consent. He allowed himself one last inventory. Hinges aligned, doors closing softly, schedules adjusted to honor breath. Policies writing themselves with reference to rooms, not imagined ideals. Boys learning what safety does to the muscles around their eyes. Men not slamming microwaves. A warden walking halls with a new ear. Administrators trusting small envelopes of truth delivered late. Prosecutors practicing the grammar of repair. The list did not promise permanence. Promise work. In the distance, beyond the window the sash now obeyed. A train hummed its patient line through the city's underbelly. It announced nothing. It carried everything. He turned toward sleep prepared to do the same. Morning would ask for Act 8. The long mentorship, the institutionalization of gentleness, the careful widening of a corridor that had once been designed only for exits. He would arrive on time with tools and a coffee tin and a plan written in the only language he trusted now. Receive, offer, repair, repeat, until even the places that had insisted they were made of stone admitted they could move. Got it, boss. I'll now continue with Act 8. Crafted fully within our voice of truth cinematic narration style. No dialogues, no headings, no cues. This act will be long, roughly equivalent to 12 pages, and will unfold as the spiritual and social aftermath of Elias's redemption, his quiet mentorship, the new rehabilitation program inspired by his story, the ripple effect across the system, and the city's gradual rediscovery of conscience through the smallest acts of repair. Title: They thought it was just a prisoner's last wish. Until his dog walked in and changed everything. Genre: emotional drama/redemption. Act 8: The architecture of return. Rain began without warning that week, the soft kind that insists on being listened to rather than endured. Water collected on rooftops, gutters confessed their weaknesses, and the city wore its dampness like a coat borrowed from an older sibling. Inside the shelter's back office, a draft ran its finger across papers pinned to a corkboard and made them shiver as if eager to participate in what they described. Words that had once been experimental now held authority. Canine-Assisted Reintegration Initiative, Pilot Phase 2. Elias read the heading as a man might study a blueprint drawn from the outline of his own scars. The plan was simple enough to survive bureaucracy. Dogs from the shelter would spend time in the prison workshop, not as therapy but as co-workers. Men would feed, train, and maintain them, earning certifications in obedience handling, basic veterinary care, and carpentry repairs for kennel structures. When they left, they would carry both skills and something the state could not quantify, a habit of gentleness that refused to be unlearned. He signed where signatures were needed, not as a mascot but as a practitioner. His title was program consultant, which made him smile for reasons he could not explain. Titles are merely disguises for trust. This one fit loosely, which is the best kind of fit. The first day inside again came with echoes. Corridors hummed with fluorescent insistence. Doors rehearsed their percussion. Yet the air no longer recognized him as property. Guards greeted him with nods shaped like memory, not obligation. He noticed small improvements. Walls repainted, lights replaced, rules rewritten to include words like reflection period instead of cool down cell. Bureaucracy had not become holy, but it had learned the tone of confession. The men waiting in the common room had built armor from boredom and fear. They wore it the way carpenters wear dust, as proof of labor, not pride. Elias entered without ceremony and laid his bag of tools on the table. Inside were brushes, leashes, collars, a spool of wire, a small jar of oil, and a copybook of notes written over months. He began not with speeches but with action, assembling a kennel panel, testing hinges, letting silence translate intent. One by one, the men abandoned their practiced indifference to watch how patience behaved when demonstrated instead of preached. A shepherd mix, restless and suspicious, became the first student. Elias crouched, extended a hand, waited for the air to settle. The dog's tremor subsided. Curiosity replaced alarm. "Notice," Elias said, but no, he didn't say, he showed. He moved slowly, stopped when tension rose, resumed when it fell. The men watched an entire vocabulary unfold without words. Stillness, allowance, adjustment. When the leash finally connected, the connection was mutual. What entered the records that afternoon was not the first successful pairing of inmate and animal. It was the first day the building learned that gentleness could be procedural. Weeks followed. Rain turned to sun, and sun to cold again, and the program grew in rhythm with the weather's patience. Men who had measured themselves only by strength began competing quietly in precision. Who could calm a barking dog first? Who could fix a latch so it closed silently? A contest of care replaced the hierarchy of threat. The warden observed from a walkway above, arms folded, eyes absorbing evidence more persuasive than any report he had ever signed. Elias kept no tally of progress. He simply moved between rooms like a man maintaining temperature. He oiled squeaky hinges, rewrapped frayed leads, taught the younger handlers how to read fear in a tail's tremor. At night he returned to his modest room in the city, jotting notes in the margin of the copybook. Less instruction, more example. 2 men cried today and called it frustration. 1 dog learned to nap near footsteps. The handwriting leaned steadier each entry, as if the pen itself had acquired faith. Outside the institution, ripples spread the way warmth travels through metal. The district attorney, now a reluctant evangelist for reform, quoted data from the pilot in speeches, but kept a photograph of Sparrow under a paperweight on her desk. The administrator drafted grant applications, her dry language betraying small bursts of lyricism she refused to edit out. The measurable outcome is quieter nights. The chaplain wrote op-eds about mercy disguised as maintenance, insisting that holiness had always lived in protocols, waiting for someone to read them differently. The media, unsatisfied with gradual miracles, lost interest. That suited everyone. Without cameras, authenticity flourished. Men spoke to dogs without performance, and dogs listened without judgment. Paperwork thickened but did not suffocate. Its signatures were written by hands that knew what they were authorizing. One evening near midsummer, the warden invited Elias to walk the yard at sunset. Grass had grown back in patches that used to be dust. The air smelled faintly of detergent and the citrus cleaner the janitorial crew favored. From the workshop came laughter, not loud, not forced, just the human sound of shared endeavor. The warden admitted quietly that he slept better. Elias nodded, equally quiet, understanding that compliments lose dignity when repeated. Later that month, a graduation was arranged without ceremony. 4 men, each carrying a leash, stood beside 4 dogs newly adopted by community members. The handler signed the final forms. The chaplain said a blessing that never mentioned heaven. Elias handed each man a small brass tag engraved, with a serial number from a dismantled door closer, a reminder that even broken mechanisms can become identification. None of the men cried publicly. Their restraint honored the moment more than tears could have. Autumn came carrying its fatigue. Funding meetings, paperwork, the slow corrosion of novelty. Elias saw the danger early, how good intentions harden into programs that forget their tenderness. He introduced small disruptions. A day without schedules, an outdoor walk under first snow, a shared meal cooked by both guards and inmates. These gestures, unrecorded in official documents, kept the system porous enough for grace to breathe through it. He understood that sustainability depended not on expansion but on ritual. Repeat what works until it becomes culture. At the shelter, Sparrow's health began to decline in the dignified way of creatures who have given all their energy to witness rather than survival. The boy noticed first shorter walks, slower climbs, deeper sleep. The mother called Elias one evening, her voice steady, to say the old dog might not see another winter. He thanked her for calling but said nothing else. Grief is a workshop with no supervisors. When he visited, Sparrow greeted him with the same economical joy. One tail movement, one deep sigh, eyes that carried an entire decade of understanding. Elias knelt and pressed his forehead to the dog's, feeling the heartbeat that had outlasted judges, bars, and paperwork. He whispered a promise without sound, that the world they had repaired together would remain tended. The boy watched silent and for the first time understood that endings can be kinds of continuity. 2 weeks later, Sparrow passed in his sleep, head resting on the boy's arm. The shelter closed early that day. Volunteers moved slowly, performing tasks that required motion because motion kept despair from hardening. The boy drew a picture, a man, a dog, a wide-open door, and left it in Elias's